All right. After being bitten by a radioactive bird, somewhat mannered T. Tuthill was possessed to become Kineas, the Skydude. This is the adventures of Kineas the Skydude number 141, where we find ourselves in India, where we left off last evening. Don't want to be too redundant. See if I can get my lips working today. Okay, all right. So let me try to remember where we were. He was going into India, but a lot of the places where they said he went weren't really well documented. It was difficult trying to find certain locations as to where he was at. And I loaded up this route earlier the best I could, but I've made a mistake. I have the wrong plane set, and now I can't change it for whatever reason. But while we're out here, I do want to, and I can't change the flight conditions and make it daytime. It's locked me in, which is really dumb. You should be able to modify and then resave, and I'm not really sure why it's not letting me at the moment. But look at what you can see. Look at how far they say he made it into India before turning back. And there's a lot of dispute between people as to why he turned back. And I guess it just depends on which side you're looking at it from, the Indian side or the Western civilization side. You know, they make it out to be like, well, his guys revolted. He's like, yeah, it's enough. Let's go ahead and go home. Other people are saying, no, he realized what he was up against. He realized that even though he was winning, he was having a heck of a time defeating all these opponents out here, and that they're possibly technologically superior, and they're very, very foreign. And it's getting weirder and weirder and weirder when it comes to stories of deities and demigods and gods, and it's getting really, really, really crazy at this point. And if we go with the Anunnaki account of how they split the world into different areas for different people to rule, he's going into the area that was supposedly held by ENLIL, the leader of the Anunnaki landing party. So the supreme leader, the supreme king of kings on earth. And you know, he may have even been told, look, man, Darius was nobody in the big picture of things. And if you're going to go any further west, you're now going to be going up against the real king of kings, and you'll never win. You know, these are not immortal, because the Anunnaki weren't immortal. They weren't gods. They were just deity somewhat too. Either way, we don't know. Okay, so let me I'm going to have to just cancel this whole thing here and start fresh. Got the right plane this time. Oh, I'm getting sad. YouTube now, the algorithm or whatever, the AI who scours videos, now it's starting to have an exception with certain pieces of music. And I don't know if it's stuff that was embedded in the Gods and Generals channel, or if it was, like when a commercial plays and it'll play a bit of something. But it's going to be a real drag if it starts flagging everything now. And I have to go back through the last several episodes and just start chopping out lots of sections. That would be horrible, and I hope the AI gets its stuff together. It's real sad. I mean, after it analyzes everything and it tells you there's no problem with your video, and then a day later it's like, these 3 audio tracks, really? You just told me 24 hours ago there was no problem. Okay. So speaking of them, of the Kings and Generals channel, let's try to find out where we were looks like they have it broken up into a couple of videos. We've already done Persian Gate. I think we did Jaxartes. Maybe not. Let's at least start there and see what they have to say. Da, 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 da. And then we'll try to find out where they're at and go from there. Okay. It's got one of those ad things right on my button.
By any metric, Alexander had achieved that aim. Alexander had defeated the Persian king twice, and he was now dead. The heartland of the Persian Empire had been taken, and the ceremonial capital sacked. After the death of Darius, though, Alexander's grander ambitions became more and more apparent, often leading to friction with some of his Macedonian officers. In this episode, we shall see how Alexander's campaign developed from a revenge mission to a total conquest of the Persian Empire, and how Alexander's faction began to show signs of cracks. Your continued support allows us to expand our work, and we're so grateful for that. We're always eager to create more videos for you.
They're an awesome channel. Truly, truly, truly. I mean, what they go to put these videos together to illuminate all of this has been absolutely wonderful. So I can't recommend their channel highly enough. All right, let me skip a little bit forward here and see if we can look at their map and get ourselves situated.
Mercenaries were rewarded even more generously. Alexander's numbers were soon further supplemented by 300 cavalry and 2,600 infantry reinforcements from Lydia, and 3,000 sent by Antipater. His army, including the reinforcements that had arrived the previous year at Babylon, now numbered something in the ballpark of 30,000 heavy infantry, 7,000 light infantry and missile troops, and 6,500 cavalry, a total of 43,500. The departure of the Greek forces, however, encouraged the Macedonian contingents to think that they would also be returning home, and many even began making preparations for the journey. Alexander, though, had already begun planning to take his army further east than any Greek had gone before, and made an impassioned speech to his men. He pointed out that although they had successfully conquered much of the Persian Empire, the subjects had still not been subdued, and that there were many other nations who would threaten their gains if they turned back now. In Alexander's view, we must either give up what we have taken, or we must seize what we do not yet hold. It would not be the last time that Alexander would have to make such a speech. Nevertheless, Alexander's words, alongside even more generous payments to his soldiers, ensured their loyalties. With Bessus having fled to Bactria, Alexander began a slow pursuit, aiming to subjugate the remaining Persian provinces en route, starting with Hyrcania. After some minor skirmishes,
Okay, so this is still a lot further back. He's still after Bessus at this point. Bessus killed Darius, and that didn't make him happy. He wanted to kill Darius. And then he kills Bessus. And so, let's see here. Yeah, he's still dealing with Bessus. That was Crapolis. I think that's where we were. Yeah, where we did end last night. All right, so let me go back. Go to the next video. Sogdian Rock. This may pick up with the first Indian kings that he's dealing with, Porus. But again, historians are mixed. Some folks say that he didn't exist. Some folks say he did exist. I don't really know what happened up to this point. They've kept really good records about everything up to this point. And it even gets weirder. They're talking about he was facing wizards, and some people said he saw UFOs, and some people were like, that's crap. He didn't see any UFOs. And But you're dealing with the land of the Vamana, and again, you're just dealing with such strange, such a strange place in the world. And so, you know, they're like, we'll write off all the stuff about wizards and flying things, and I just don't know that we should. I really don't know that we should. Okay, this is a vacuum commercial. Try to skip that here.
Alexander's victory at the Jaxartes had secured his northern border. However, his choice to focus on the border meant that the revolt of Bactria and Sogdiana had continued, and that Spitamenes remained at large. The revolt would prove to be Alexander's greatest challenge, and would reveal some of his greatest attributes, such as his military flexibility and his mastery of psychological warfare, but also some of his worst, such as his brutality and pettiness. Today, there's no one with as much power over your life as the old kings had, unless someone and away you. Bonus month of Nordpar, negotiate with the rebels and help bring the revolt to a swift conclusion. To compensate for his lack of experience, he had also been assigned several of Alexander's officers to act as military advisors. When Pharnaces' force of more than 2,000 infantry and 300 cavalry closed in on Marikanda, Spitamenes pulled back. Pharnaces pursued eagerly, unaware that he was being lured into a trap. On the edge of the Sogdian desert, near the river Polytimetus, Spitamenes' army was reinforced by 600 Massagetae cavalry and turned to face Pharnaces. The Massagetae cavalry peppered the Macedonian infantry with missile fire and used quick hit-and-run tactics to harass their flanks. The Macedonian cavalry, outnumbered and less agile, was unable to drive the enemy off, and it was soon clear that the army was in a disastrous position. The infantry formed a square and retreated to nearby woods, aiming to cross the river. Without a decisive leader at their head, the officers assigned to Pharnaces communicated poorly, the cavalry crossing the river first, and the infantry following without having been given an order to do so. The crossing was chaotic, and Spitamenes' force kept harassing the force as they crossed, some of his men managing to cross the river at other fords and attack Pharnaces from the opposite bank. Pharnaces' force was now surrounded, and the entire...
Okay, let me pause right there. All right, so if this is right, but the first thing they say is, we don't know the exact location. How did they not know the exact location? But based on what the best guess, or what the best they understand, going back over to Microsoft Flight Simulator, this is that location. So go ahead and get our the sun up here, and let's spawn in here. There's the river out in front of us, but again, right off the bat, they're like, we're not 100% certain as to where this took place, but this is our best guess. Acropolis was the largest of 7 towns in the region that Alexander the Great targeted for conquest in 329 BC. His goal was the conquest of Sogdiana. Okay. So, very, very modern place today. I mean, it's got some large buildings, as we see over there. Nice stadiums. Looking back, yeah, this seems like a very, very, very important place in the past, and it's very important today, it seems. Anyway, so they're saying that this battle took place here. So if we go back to it now, we're at the river.
entire force of 2,000 infantry and 300 horsemen were either cut down or captured. It was the largest military loss Alexander's army ever suffered in Asia. Alexander, returning from the Jaxartes and hearing the news, immediately marched on Maracanda, where Spitamenes had returned to the siege.
Spitamenes.
Upon hearing of his approach, Spitamenes again retreated westward towards the desert, with Alexander in pursuit.
Because he's a chump.
Spitamenes began to withdraw further into the desert. Alexander, however, could not be so easily lured and turned his army back to Maracanda, burying Pharnaces' dead en route as best he could. Unable to catch Spitamenes, Alexander proceeded to carry out brutal reprisals on the Sogdians. For the rest of summer 329, his army devastated the area, burning fields of crops, and according to Rufus, Alexander ordered the death of
someone trying to burn my crops.
Age. The total number killed during this period cannot be known for sure, but some modern historians suggest that the number may have been as high as 120,000. Despite this, the revolt continued, and Alexander found himself embroiled in a guerrilla war, unable to defeat his enemies in one decisive battle. To adapt to this, Alexander split his army into parts, under the commands of Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Perdiccas Coenus, and himself. This could be considered one of the earliest examples of a corps system that Napoleon Bonaparte would use so successfully to his advantage 2 millennia later. Each of these corps would operate independently, suppressing any resistance they could. At the same time, Alexander founded a further 6 cities in the area to try and bring the province under control once and for all. However, even after he received reinforcements of 20,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry from the western satrapies and Greece, the revolt persisted. In the spring of 328, the army rejoined at Maracanda. The governor of the province, Artabazes, had asked to retire due to his old age, and Alexander accepted, appointing Cletus the Black as his replacement. While in the city, Alexander and his officers performed a religious ritual, which, as was often the case, later developed into a drinking party. The sources vary about exactly what was said by who, but as the evening progressed and all the men became drunk, some of the younger officers began to praise Alexander, comparing him to Heracles, to the annoyance of the older officers. Soon after, Alexander himself even began to claim that he was superior to his father, Philip. At this point, Cletus, who had fought under Philip and whose sister had helped raise Alexander, spoke up, saying, "Alexander's deeds were neither in fact so great or marvelous, nor had he achieved them by himself, but for the most part they were the deeds of the Macedonians." Cletus even began praising Parmenion and criticizing Alexander for allowing Persians into his court and embracing more Persian customs, at which point Alexander leapt up, calling Cletus a coward. Cletus retorted, "It was this cowardice of mine, however, that saved your life, God-born as you are," referencing when he had saved Alexander at the Granicus. Alexander lunged at Cletus, but was held back by his personal bodyguards, who also discreetly removed his sword, trying to defuse the situation. Alexander called for his other guards, but none came, and Cletus was effectively dragged out of the room by other officers. With Cletus gone, Alexander's friends tried to calm him, begging him to leave the matter for tomorrow. As they were doing so, though, Cletus burst back into the room, quoting a line of Euripides, "Alas, in Hellas, what an evil government." Enraged, Alexander grabbed a spear from one of the guards and stabbed Cletus, killing him.
Wow.
Alright guys, so this is the easy ritual that's helped my grandma drop close to 72 pounds.
Oh, I'm glad for your grandma, I really am. Alright, so after that battle where we just were, he went after Spitamenes or whatever the guy's name was, and he went back east. And then he's going to cut south again. So somewhere way out in the distance, around the mountain ridge, and I don't know if that's the ones closer to us or the ones further. But he's going to go after this place called the Sogdian Rock. And I have the URL, well, basically the URL of where it's at, the coordinates. So, getting some strong winds that are pushing us around today. So normally, you know me, I love flying everything, but it's with as many places and as fast as he's moving. I mean, he's going to do, if we go to all the places, we're supposed to do like 900 miles. Can't do 900 miles in a couple hours. All right, so let's just do a teleport. So it says that the Sogdian rock is... I want to see pictures of your grandma. Flash in the leg.
Alex.
That's just wrong. Okay. So the location of Sogdian rock is 44694. Let me zoom back out. So we're coming from... I lost where we were. By the way, we're coming down and coming back around the mountain range. And I don't rightly see it. It's supposed to be a mountain fortress. Maybe. But it was supposedly had mountains around all sides. Maybe this is the area of it. Because they couldn't get up this way. I think they laughed at him saying, unless you have men that can fly, you're not getting up here. This is possibly the location here. Because he needed men to climb these rocks in the middle of the night and get above the town. So we'll go ahead and go there.
Alexander immediately regretted his actions and turned the spear around, about to kill himself, but was restrained by his bodyguards. They then carried the king to bed, where Alexander remained for the next few days, refusing food and drink, weeping and crying out Cleitus's name. It is important to understand that this was not just a case of a friend killing a friend. By killing Cleitus at a banquet where they had shared food and drink, Alexander had broken the rules of Xenia, the rules of Greek hospitality that were sacred to Zeus, who Alexander had been proclaimed the son of. Numerous attempts to console him, including from court historian and philosopher Callisthenes, failed. It was only when Anisarchus, another philosopher, pointed out to Alexander that as the king of kings and son of Zeus Ammon, the laws did not apply to him in the same way, that Alexander was pulled out of his depression. Though Alexander clearly did regret his actions, the death of Cleitus does reveal a dark side to Alexander. Carney, a leading Alexander historian, has argued that Cleitus's death, while not planned, may have been motivated in part by the justification that Anisarchus provided, that Alexander wanted to rule as the unquestionable king of kings, in contrast to traditional Macedonian monarchy where nobles like Cleitus would often feel free to criticize their king. Moreover, as stressed by Worthington, the episode shows how petty Alexander could be, particularly when it came to comparisons between him and his father. While all this had been going on, Spitamenes and his Massagetian allies were still at large, having avoided Alexander's forces, and were harassing cities in Bactria, extracting bribes from some and defeating at least one garrison that sallied out against him. Alexander again decided to split his force, sending part of the army into Bactria, forcing Spitamenes to retreat towards the Massagetae border. Craterus, in command of part of the army, heard of this and moved his force to try and catch Spitamenes once and for all, catching up to his 1,000-strong force on the edge of a desert. In the ensuing battle, Craterus was able to secure a victory, but the majority of Spitamenes' agile force was able to escape, having lost just 150 men. Despite this setback, Spitamenes had, nevertheless, been largely successful in his guerrilla campaign, with even more men from Massagethe, increasing his force to 4,000. When Spitamenes and this army arrived back in Sogdiana, sometime near the end of 328 or the start of 327, they found the province well defended by the new forts Alexander had constructed, all with strong garrisons. Coenus, stationed in the area by Alexander with a force of approximately 4,000 infantry, 400 cavalry, and an unknown number of horse archers that had recently been added to Alexander's army, set out in pursuit. Spitamenes, seeing that there were no easy targets in the province to attack, finally decided to meet the Macedonians in a pitched battle near Bagae.
Okay, so we were...
The details of the battle...
So we were all the way on the right hand of the screen here in Cryopolis, and now I've spawned us down here. Right here where the text ends. The Sogdian Rock. So this is all taking place, yeah, up over here now. And
battle are unknown, but the result was a victory for Coenus, Arrian giving his losses as being just 32, while Spitamenes lost 800. These numbers, particularly Coenus's casualties, are likely inaccurate, but it is clear that it was a decisive victory for Coenus. Spitamenes himself survived the battle, but was soon betrayed by the Massagethe, who cut off his head and sent it to Alexander.
Yay!
Spitamenes had been one of the most tenacious opponents Alexander had faced.
Yeah, he was a real son of a gun.
Guerrilla warfare to maximize the effectiveness of his smaller force, consistently avoiding being pinned down, and had even inflicted the largest military defeat on Alexander's army. His death meant that the end of the Bactrian-Sogdian revolt was almost in sight, with only a few local tribes in mountainous citadels continuing to defy Alexander. The taking of these fortresses would require some of the most creative tactics in Alexander's career. The most notable of these holdouts was the so-called Sogdian Rock, a mountain fortress under the command of Ariamazes, where a number of rebellious tribal leaders and their families had sought refuge. Early in 327, Alexander left his winter quarters of Nautica and advanced towards the Sogdian Rock. On the march, however, a colossal blizzard swept in, and temperatures plummeted. Alexander ordered that huge areas of forest be cut down and burned to keep the men warm, and rode throughout the army, encouraging his men on. But nonetheless, the cold took its toll on many, some men freezing to death as they leaned against trees to take a short rest. The storm continued for 3 days, by the end of which 2,000 of Alexander's men had died. In time, Alexander finally reached the Sogdian Rock, which according to Rufus was garrisoned by as many as 30,000 soldiers. This number is remarkably high, however, and it is possible that Rufus had mistakenly included civilians in his counting. Nevertheless, the rock was widely considered to be unconquerable. It was well defended, with supplies to last a siege for at least 2 years, and was located in a strong defensive location, surrounded by steep cliffs and made even more secure by the winter snow that would make any assault particularly difficult. As a result of these factors, when Alexander arrived with his army and sent emissaries demanding Ariamazes' surrender, he was strongly rebuffed, the Sogdians laughing, claiming that Alexander would need winged soldiers to conquer the place. As the siege of Tyre had shown, however, Alexander was not one to be intimidated by the notion of a place being unconquerable.
Want to know how I get this glow?
Dang.
I get ready with new Olay Indulgent Moisture.
They're hitting us with all kinds of commercials now. They know they got a good thing. All right, so, you know, we got to look around the terrain here, and this one is up here, and it's got some rocks on the side. I don't know that that would be, you know, impenetrable. It's got a little, I mean, there was something there. Oh, you're not seeing what I'm seeing. I get this under control today. You know, that sure kind of fits the bill. Indeed it does. And then this had a little walled thing around it. So possibly this is it. Considering it's all wiped off the map. This is what I was looking for out here. An artificial mound. Or artificial mounds of any kind. And you'll understand why in just a moment.
Facing Alexander's army, but had neglected to man the cliff at his rear, confident that such an approach would be impossible. Alexander seized on this opportunity. He requested 300 volunteers from his army who had climbing experience, and offered prizes to all who completed the climb, including a handsome reward of 12 talents to the first man to reach the top of the cliff. In order for the move to be kept hidden from Ariamazes, the climb would have to be done under the cover of darkness, making the already perilous mission even more dangerous. Nonetheless, Alexander got his volunteers, and after supplying them with iron tent pegs and ropes, they began the climb. It was a difficult ascent, with 30 of the men falling to their deaths, Alexander anxiously watching the top of the cliff throughout the night for the signal from his men that they had succeeded. At dawn, he finally saw his men at the summit, waving white sheets as had been prearranged. With these men in position, Alexander moved his main force forward and again requested Ariamazes' surrender. Again he was refused, until Alexander pointed to the top of the cliffs behind Ariamazes' position, saying that he did indeed have winged soldiers. Ariamazes, unable to tell just how many men were threatening his rear, surrendered without a fight. Alexander's force marched in unopposed, and many of the Sogdian nobles were either captured or executed for their part in the revolt. There was only one last place of significance to resistance to Alexander, the Rock of Corienes, under the command of Sisamithres. It was also an incredibly well-defended position, surrounded on all sides by steep cliffs and a ravine, with the only path leading to the rock being narrow, steep, and easily defended. Once again, Alexander sent emissaries demanding the Sogdians' surrender, and once again he was rebuffed. Undeterred, Alexander prepared to take another place considered unconquerable. He first constructed ladders, allowing his men to descend into the ravine, where they began the process of hammering stakes into both sides. On top of these, they constructed supports, building a bridge and packing earth on top. Much like at Tyre, Alexander planned to construct a land bridge across the ravine so that his army would be able to attack from level ground. His army was split into 3 rotating divisions that continued to work day and night, but progress was nonetheless slow thanks to the snowy conditions and harassing arrows from Sisamithres' men. Wooden screens were soon created to protect the workers, and Alexander's men continued the construction, slowly closing in on the Sogdians. To add to the growing intimidation, Alexander also brought up his siege engines in position to begin a bombardment of the defenses. Before any attack began, however, Alexander sent a final emissary to the Sogdians. The emissary stressed to Sisamithres how dire his situation was becoming, and that once Alexander's causeway was complete and the siege engines began firing, his defeat would be inevitable. Disheartened, Sisamithres also surrendered without a fight. The taking of the Rock of Corienes marked the end of the Bactrian-Sogdian revolt.
Okay, so it was the first place we spawned into that I thought was it to begin with. That is the Corienes area, and then we went uprange. So when I first spawned us in, I spawned us in over here. And what we were shooting for ended up being over here. I wonder if this was a gold mining operation. Here we were. Here's the path that he took up. And his people had to climb up on these cliffs here. Okay.
Soon after the siege, Alexander took his first wife, a local princess named Roxana.
Okay, that's another thing. I've seen several different versions. I mean, in every story that I've watched on Alexander, it's always been different. Where and when he hooks up with Roxana. So, in one story, in like the movie version with Richard Burton, where he plays Alexander, Roxana is Darius III's daughter. So at the Battle of Gaugamela, or Issus, I'm sorry, Battle of Issus, where he defeats Darius for the first time, Darius runs away. Alexander captures his wife, his family, everything. And he keeps them with him as he goes into Egypt. And they really don't talk about that through this series, but he's had them with him the whole time. But at the end of that movie, when he goes into the tent to capture the family or meet the family, he's like, and your name is? I'm Roxana. Okay, so they introduce him there. I think in the more modern movie, he hooks up with Roxana after Babylon. So which would kind of be more in this area. I think they kind of have that she's more over here on the Indian side, but it seems like they make her out to be more Mesopotamian. I could be wrong there. And where was the other story where they hooked up? Well, I can't remember at the moment. But again, now in this story, this is where he's hooking up with her. Again, in this town here. I wish we could put pins on the map. At least we lock it in that way. So to get an idea of how far we've traveled now, and again, was up to the north. All the way up here, we were over here. Hard to see in the dark. Yeah, here's the Persian Gulf down here. So here's Babylon and stuff over in here. So he had to come down. He went to Persepolis, destroyed everything down in here, and then went north to deal with Darius here, but Bassus killed Darius in the north up here. And then he had to chase him around for a while. And then he started making his way into India. Well, he had to chase that guy, Bassus, around. So then he made his way up into India. And he's been dealing with them, and they're proving to be incredibly difficult. And now they said he came in here, and this is all part of the Sogda region. So they said these last two strongholds up in these mountain fortresses. And once he gets these, he's secured this whole area.
She and her father, Oxyates, had taken refuge at either the Sogdian Rock or Rock of Corienes, depending on the source.
The Soggy Rock.
When Alexander first saw her, he is supposed to have fallen in love immediately, considering her the most beautiful woman in Asia. The marriage also served a political purpose for
They have some beautiful women over there.
closely to the local nobility and helping to subdue the unruly Bactrians and Sogdians. It had taken Alexander approximately 2 years to completely subdue the two satrapies, roughly the same amount of time that it had taken him to conquer lands from the Aegean to Egypt. It was, without a doubt, the most difficult period of Alexander's campaign so far, and cost his army the largest number of casualties. Approximately 5,000 of Alexander's men had been lost to Spitamenes' guerrilla tactics throughout the course of the revolt, and at least a further 2,000 to cold.
Sucks.
The revolt had shown that Alexander was not only a master of tactical, but also of psychological warfare, taking two supposedly unconquerable places without a fight. However, it also highlighted some of the darkest aspects of Alexander's character. Though often benevolent to his enemies, his brutal tactics in Sogdiana showed how willing he was to use fear and force as a means of control. Similarly, the murder of Cleitus showed that, despite how mature and reasonable Alexander could be, he could also be petty, hot-tempered, and tyrannical.
Yeah, and friends could be real jerks, man.
Beneficial in the short term, was unpopular with many in his army, who now had what they considered a barbarian queen, and would prove to be a significant issue in the long run. With the revolt crushed, Alexander was the undisputed master of the Persian Empire. However, even during the revolt, Alexander was planning his next campaign. He would next lead his army beyond the borders of the Persian Empire and into India. And in our next episode, we'll talk about the famous Battle of Hydaspes, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it.
Okay.
Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind
That's weird, it's still playing.
YouTube channel members, whose
Oh, there it
you
is.
can join via the links in the description.
All right. So that concludes all the Persian Empire then. I thought that northern part was still part of India, and my mistake. He hasn't engaged any elephants yet. So this proved to be his biggest challenge up to this point. He's lost more troops than he's ever lost. Cold sucks. The snow sucks. His friends are moaning and bitching, and every bit of it is understandable from every person's point of view. I still feel badly for him because Alexander, because he's been getting red pilled the whole time, and what he is privy to, the information he's privy to, with the exception of possibly his closest people, but you'll see that even some of the closest people, they say that there was a problem. But as of Egypt, only he has certain information. And these people that he's encountering actually along the way as he's dealing with them, the whole way he's got to be searching for more information, going to the temples, getting all the documents, and finding out everything you can about now the lineage of the different the gods, the Anunnaki, the people that put the humans in charge of all these areas. Okay. Here it is. It is Persianization of Alexander the Great. And that's another thing I think his friends should have understood too is, you're coming from Macedonia. Your people have, however, through the past have gone up north, but you're considered a barbarian, and as you're coming down into and have taken over Persia now, you have to respect how much older, how far back. And I don't know that the average guy really could grasp how much time had existed before they were even a spot on the map. And for them to not understand the bigger picture that's going on here. But nothing we can do about that now but speculate. Okay.
When I learned about Mind Bloom, I was curious.
I was not curious. I had no inclination to find out more about this Mind Bloom thing. Sorry, but I don't, you know.
Alexander of Macedon's conquest of the Achaemenid Persian Empire is one of the single most famous campaigns in world history, and was ultimately responsible for spreading classical Greek culture as far east as India. However, as Alexander seeded the culture of the Hellenes throughout Iran and Central Asia, so too did the ancient and sophisticated cultures of those regions influence him. From events like the proskynesis at Bactria to Alexander apparently dressing up in the Persian fashion, many have wondered just how Persianized Alexander became, with some even postulating that he became so nativized that he became a Zoroastrian, an adherent of the faith of the Achaemenid Persian kings.
Okay, so that's the thing. Names change all the time. And Zeus is called, even by the Romans later, you know, they called Jupiter. So the different names. Isis is Anana, and she's been known by a bunch of different names. So they're saying right now, they're upset that he's possibly even become a Zoroastrian. But if you keep going back further and further and further in time, it's all the same story. So his men didn't even understand that. This shouldn't come up. It's like, you've got to understand that Zeus is this guy, and this guy is this person, and this person is this person, and, you know, you're getting further and further and further back into the story. And so, of course, it makes perfect sense to me that absolutely he would want to know everything that there is about Zoroastrianism. Ahura Mazda, again, names change. Enki, Enlil, the Anunnaki. And also, again, they split the world into 4 sections, giving each leader control over a section of the earth. Yada, yada, yada. So yeah, it makes sense to me.
To find out whether or not there is truth in this, we must examine how Alexander engaged with the conquered peoples of Persia, and how he went about consolidating his rule. Welcome to our video on Alexander and the Persians, their relationship, and how Alexander engaged with Zoroastrianism. Winning an empire might be hard, but keeping it is harder, and a similar lesson has been learned by many.
I love this, the way they tie into the Manscaped or whoever their sponsors are. They're hilarious. I love you guys.
Before we analyze Alexander in Persia, we must first understand how Persian kingship was linked to Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is a dualistic religion focused on the great lord Ahura Mazda, his emanations, the Amesha and their fight against the great lie, Angra Mainyu, and his emanations, the Ahuras. The traditional title of the Achaemenid monarch, Shahanshah, or King of Kings, was intrinsically linked to Zoroastrianism. Most Achaemenid kings throughout history were probably practicing Zoroastrians in one way or another, although some paid homage to other religions too. The cylinder of Cyrus the Great, for example, mentions the Babylonian god Marduk. Darius the Great most certainly used Zoroastrianism, exalting Ahura Mazda and all the gods. Overall, while...
Okay. Now, when we were at the Great Pyramids, if you can recall that story, and if not, you might want to go back and watch that episode where we're in Egypt at the pyramids. And I'm sorry I didn't bookmark. I'll have to take some time to go back through the this series and put chapters on everything. All right. When we were at the pyramids, I spoke to you about Marduk. Marduk was in this section of the world the main ruler. Okay. Now in the far past, he was just, you know, one of the guys that was part of the main landing party, as I understand, or he was a son from somebody. Maybe Enki. I'm not really certain if it was Enki or Enlil. I don't remember anymore. It's been so darn long. But Marduk caused all that trouble in Egypt with Isis and Anana. And all that created so much scandal. Go back out here. In Egypt. That they waged war on him and they deposed him. And that's when he took on the name Amun-Ra. Meaning the hidden god. He was exiled and stripped from power. And him and his son, Nabu, were both deposed, and they moved the seat of power. Okay, so they're saying Darius was a Zoroastrian, and he was following Ahura. No, Ahura. Like Star Trek, Ahura Mazda. And that the other ones were following... Let me rewind that a little bit.
Mentions the Babylonian god Marduk. Darius the Great most...
Okay, so Cyrus was a follower of Marduk, and Darius was a follower of Ahura. Okay, now, when they landed here, if the stories are true, and if the translations are true, this is the best I recall, there was lots and lots and lots of them, and they were all spread out working on different things. All right, and they were all, at some point, they were all rulers of, like generals and lieutenants and whatever. They were all rulers out around the world doing their thing. Well, factions started happening, and they all started getting into fights, as people do and families do. And so again, these people that had broken off and were put into place by Cyrus, or as Cyrus took over, his faction was, against the rulership of Marduk, or something like that. He supported Marduk. Either way, it's very complicated, because it's a huge, huge, huge operation all over the planet.
Certainly used Zoroastrianism, exalting Ahura Mazda and all the gods. Overall, while the Achaemenid Empire was relatively tolerant and regional satraps often cooperated with local religious authorities, Persian kingship was linked to Zoroastrianism. Consequently, Persepolis, the imperial capital, was a center of Persian religion, whose Apadana Palace has reliefs of tribute-giving nations to the King of Kings. One of the tablets from Persepolis shows the interplay of universal monarchy and Zoroastrianism. Darius, the great king, king of kings, king of countries, son of Hystaspes and Achaemenid. King Darius says, "This is the kingdom which I hold, from the Sake, who are beyond Sogdia, to Kush, and from Sind to Lydia. This is what Ahura Mazda, the greatest of gods, bestowed upon me. May Ahura Mazda protect me and my royal house." Indeed, every aspect of Persian kingship was intrinsically linked to Zoroastrianism, with royal clothing and diadems present in many pictures. Achaemenid kings also demanded tribute and submission in a highly ritualized manner, while royal ideology intrinsically sought the approval of Ahura Mazda, which served as a sign of the overlordship over the Persian Empire. It is this deeply rooted tradition of Zoroastrian kingship that Alexander encountered while conquering his way through Asia. As the young Macedonian king's empire grew massive, he found himself having to balance his objectives between his many diverse subjects outside of his Macedonian heartland. For the southern Greek city-states, he was a pan-Hellenic leader who was supposed to enact revenge on the Persians for their invasion of Greece a century earlier. Meanwhile, in the Achaemenid Empire, he had two other groups to manage: the local elites of countries like Egypt, Babylon, Bactria, and India, who had been peripheral foreign vassals to the Persians, as well as the Persian elites themselves, who were traditionally much more invested in the Achaemenid kingship that Alexander had deposed. The balance between Greeks and Persians is particularly important, as the former made up the army he had conquered Persia with, and the latter his collaborators in helping rule the land he had conquered. All these groups influenced his choices going forward.
Colorado parents, do you want to get paid to take care of your...
No, I don't. They show that he extends his empire all the way out to the other ocean, but I don't believe he went that far at all. I mean, but they sure make it seem like in that last little route description that he made it all the way out to China. Or, damn, this is kind of creepy.
Technique of rule usually was to appeal to local sensibilities.
All right, so they're just saying he made it down to here.
It was no different to many Persian emperors. In Egypt, he presented himself as pharaoh and a liberator, while in Babylon, he conducted sacrifices in the great temples there. In short, he was not afraid to adopt local customs. This was something regional satraps of the late Achaemenid Empire had also done, particularly ones who worked with the local ruling elites. These actions established the allegiance of the local populations, a famous example being the Jews of Jerusalem, who were generally receptive to their Persian and later Macedonian governors' tolerance towards their monotheistic faith. In peripheral territories, like Egypt, Babylon, and Judah, Alexander generally had little trouble establishing legitimacy to rule, as it was simply a matter of replacing one foreign overlord with another. However, in Persia proper, establishing that legitimacy was more complicated. Alexander had to both show that he was superior to the late Achaemenid king Darius, but also that he was a friend of both Greeks and Persians. To that end, when Alexander won the Battle of Issus, he is said to have treated Darius's wife, Statera, with utmost respect. Alexander also adopted many traditional pillars of Persian royal symbolism. For example, the use of the royal tent of the Persians, which had once allowed Achaemenid kings to travel their vast lands with mobility while also displaying their symbolic wealth and prestige. Moreover, Persian bodyguards were incorporated by Alexander. Historical accounts by Plutarch call these bodyguards melophori, or apple bearers. The Achaemenids once used that very same institution as an assisting force to the infamous 10,000 immortals. In addition, the Persian King of Kings was meant to be isolated and communication to be done via messengers. This was so that his subjects would not have much contact with him, and that the king could maintain an allure of supremacy. As time went on, Alexander made more use of these methods to appeal to his Persian and Bactrian subjects. There was also the habit of proskinesis, of bowing and prostrating oneself before the king. Many Greeks saw these acts of ostentation as a deification of Alexander and protested against its use. Evidently, these protests were heeded when in 327 BCE, Alexander excused his Greek troops from performing the Persianized court theatrics he had adopted. Overall, the Greeks, the ones who lived under monarchies like the Macedonians, were much more conservative about projections of royal power, which was why they considered Alexander's adoption of Persian court practices to be an attempt at vain deification. However, contrary to that viewpoint, it seems Alexander was simply utilizing Persian institutions and practices to ensure the loyalty of his new Iranian subjects. Let us now move on to the treatment of Zoroastrianism by Alexander, and how this relates to his ideas of kingship. Alexander appears to have been politically savvy in his engagement with the Persian religion. In particular, in his alleged correspondence to his archenemy, Darius, he prefers to use the name King of Asia, while addressing Darius as Great King. This suggests that he was seeking a title far grander than King of Kings. According to the account of Arrian, his reply to one of Darius's letters reads as follows: "But now I have defeated in battle first your generals and satraps, and now you in person and your army, and by the grace of the gods I control the country. All those who fought on your side and did not die in battle but came over to me, I hold myself responsible for them. They are not on my side under duress, but are taking part in the expedition of their own free will. In future, whenever you communicate with me, send to me as King of Asia. Do not write me as an equal, but state your demands to the master of all your possessions. If not, I shall deal with you as a wrongdoer. If you wish to lay claim to the title of king, then stand your ground and fight for it. Do not take to flight, as I shall pursue you wherever you may be. We can thus see that Alexander, while emulating the custom of the King of Kings, was aiming to create his own royal ideology. By making himself grander than Darius, Alexander was becoming a universal monarch, with claims not just on Persia, but the entire world beyond. This can be seen in his regalia. Although inspired by previous Persian designs, Alexander's dress and diadem when he became ruler of Persia was meant to visually inspire a new, even grander form of rulership. An interesting case study of Alexander's relationship to Zoroastrianism can be seen in Persepolis, where the Macedonian conqueror is well known to have been courteous to Cyrus's tomb at Pasargadae, which had allegedly fallen into disrepair. While we don't know why the tomb had been neglected, we know that Alexander had demanded it be restored to its full glory, and also that the priests who neglected it be tortured. However, Alexander was also known to have suppressed Zoroastrianism in certain instances as well. For example, he allegedly broke a lot of Persian religious artifacts in Persepolis itself, which has been interpreted as his attempt to assert the Greek gods as the chief religion of the realm, thereby displacing Zoroastrianism. It is also claimed that after conquering Persepolis, Alexander staged a banquet to celebrate his victories. There, a prostitute called Thais challenged the drunken conqueror to avenge the burning of the city of Athens, which occurred over a century ago. Alexander agreed and invited his army to join him, burning Persepolis to the ground. Later Zoroastrian sources claim that he did this deliberately to burn one of the 2 golden copies of the Avesta, the Zoroastrian holy text.
I had it just a minute ago. I had us right over Persepolis.
From Sasanian times, centuries later, Alexander is seen as an agent of the Great Lie, who destroyed the great empire of the Iranians. To many historians, Alexander's anti-Persian policies were an attempt to earn the legitimacy of his Greek soldiers by enacting revenge for Xerxes' invasion of Greece a century earlier, thus showing that he was a monarch of many faces, adopting Persian rights while settling Hellenic blood feuds. Indeed, Alexander granted tolerance to all religions of the empire and actively sought to incorporate himself within them. For example, Arab tribes in the south were said to worship 2 gods, and Alexander declared that they should worship him as a 3rd god. In Gantara, he identified local deities, most likely Vasudeva and Rudra, with Heracles and Dionysos respectively. In short, Alexander was not looking to eradicate Zoroastrianism, but merely replace it as the chief religion of Persia with the gods of the Greeks, Zeus, Heracles, Athena, Dionysos and Apollo. The Zoroastrian faith, however, persisted alongside other faiths and continued to hold a decreased, albeit still important role in Hellenic-era Persian society. Alexander has been called the last of the Achaemenids by historian Pierre Briand due to his continuation of many Achaemenid policies, evident in the fact that he engaged with Persian elite networks, like any Achaemenid king would, and also used the administrative networks that the Achaemenids themselves used to run their empire. We have spoken previously on the imperial bureaucracy of the Achaemenids, and Alexander utilized it rather efficiently. Many Persian satraps maintained their control of some of their territories, so long as they pledged allegiance to Alexander. However, Alexander also added many Macedonian satraps and split up the power amongst multiple rulers in one region. Alexander sought this appeal to ensure continuity and stability of the revenue streams of the empire to his coffers. Not all Persians accepted the new rulers. Bessus, the assassin of Darius, had proclaimed himself his successor and had fled to Bactria. Alexander is said to have been made successor by Darius in his dying words, but this is at best fanciful speculation. Alexander chased the competitor throughout the mountains and valleys of Central Asia, often conducting brutal repression upon the locals. The Bactrians were never easy to control by the Achaemenids and were no fans of the new arrivals. Alexander often conducted brutal sieges in cities, as he had in Tyre, and in the case of the city of Branchide, massacred the entire population. It is here that we must also consider the presence of both Persians and women in Alexandrian politics. Persian troops accompanied Alexander loyally in his campaigns, but appear to have been separate from the Greek troops. This suggests that Alexander still had to balance between Greek and Macedonian interests. However, he still thought that many Persians should have a Greek education. Macedonian royalty, with its equestrian and hunting, allowed for some ease with the integration with Persian nobles, who espoused similar values. Alexander's mindset is best exemplified in the Susa weddings, where Greek soldiers married Persian women. Alexander also married Roshanak, or Roxane, or Sogdiana, as a convenient marriage and reconciliation.
Or the names are always changing.
The sort of conquest, as the sexist ancient world saw the conquest of the women of the enemy as a symbol of victory. Most of these weddings ended in divorce, with one notable exception. Seleucus, one of Alexander's most trusted comrades, maintained his marriage to Apama of Sogdiana, and followed in his friend's footsteps in maintaining links with the Persian nobility. He would later found the Seleucid Empire, which ruled over Persia. Alexander's policy shows that he tried to engage with all political actors in the empire, from Greeks to Persians to Bactrians. Links with Persian nobility and Zoroastrianism were strong in terms of maintaining continuity. Yet Alexander also showed the triumph of Hellenism through acts of defilement of previous Persian heritage. Many Greek sources see this as barbarizing, yet we can also see that this was a careful political strategy, possibly inspired by Persian kingship itself. Alexander the Great certainly became more Persian throughout his campaigns, preserving and adopting the customs and networks of the King of Kings. Alexander engaged with the Persian nobility and even attempted to connect them to the Greeks through the Susa weddings. However, Alexander also had to engage with the Hellenic part of his army, and certainly aimed to install a new order as King of Asia. This is perhaps the most intriguing part of Alexander's vision, the inability to be put in a specific label or a box. Alexander's vision of conquest was his own, but it was inseparable from the Persian ideas of universal monarchy and pan-Hellenic martial values. It is this ideology that changed both Greece and Persia forever, and ushered the vibrant Hellenistic age. More videos on the Hellenistic age are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to
Oh, no, one more, please. Okay.
Alexander of Macedon's conquest of the Achaemenid Persian Empire is one of the single most...
Okay. That was a surprising episode. They didn't do any battles. They just talked about kind of what I was talking about. I mean, they were, the mixing of the cultures. Anyway, it's very, very interesting. But they definitely talked about the Temple of Cyrus, and we're in Persepolis again. And I did want to... I kind of glossed over it last night. Okay. And I'm almost wondering, and he said that the priests, because they had let things to go to crap, that they should be killed. And I focused on those pyramid structures out on the plains out there, just out of the blue. 2 little pyramid structures. I think that's one of them there. Yep. So I highlighted those coming in. So it extends from the city way out there to all up here into the foothills, and then it seems like they had the palaces up in, up tucked away, as the other ones did. They used the backsides of the mountain as protection, right? So you have to think about what you're seeing here in terms of fortifications and royal palaces up against these walls. This one's in shadow a little bit, but you could make out there's something definitely complex going on, or was. Out there it was pretty large and almost garden-like, but out here, looks like lots of little rooms. At least that's what my eyes see. So there are different rulers in the area, and you hear how Darius talked. I am the King of Kings. I'm the King of Kings. When in reality there were really, really some kings, and then there was everybody else that was put in charge of their little territory. So it would have been more proper for him to say, and this is where the Persians got into trouble, according to the Greeks. They should have been saying, I am a king of kings. I am Darius. I am a king of kings, because you're a steward. Yeah, it's, it is our planet, but they put specific bloodlines in charge. And there wasn't just because, so the earth is so big, there's not just one family in charge. So they set up kings everywhere. But ultimately, they're all stewards, right? And they're blah, 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 blah. So I think it was Herodotus later goes on to say that it was that, that kind of arrogance that the Persians later displayed. They're so far removed now from the past that I don't know that they believe it anymore. The same with us today. We are so far removed from that past that we have no idea. We have no way of knowing if it was true or not. And we're probably less likely to believe any of it today. But, if the translations are right, it should be eye-opening to everybody, because they're talking about, they never say that they were gods from heaven. They always are really clear that these are gods from the sky. And if Sitchin's translations are at all accurate, we know the name of their planet, we know the name of their king, we know their histories, and why they came here. So they were having a wicked dilemma on their planet, keeping it warm. And so the first operations that they wanted to set up here on Earth was to mine gold. So they have an idea on how to suspend gold into their atmosphere to actually create like a global warming situation. But their planet was cooling. And I don't know if that, ultimately, I don't know, as of today, like, did that end up working or not? They seem to think everything was all right, I guess. Because they all left Earth at one point. They're like, we're done. We're done here. And at that point, again, they start turning everything over. Now, a lot of them, like Marduk, okay? Marduk, when everybody left or was leaving, here's an opportunity for some Nibiruan to become like, again, like the King of Kings. Because there aren't any other actual Anunnaki on the planet to oppose him. All he's got to deal with now are human rulers in the place of, you know, as stewards for their Anunnaki lord. So that's why you get all these factions. So it looks like all the development. I'm sure there's more. And then you can see downrange, they're still building. But I hope you've been noticing as I've been flying around the terrain right up against this mountain. The whole time I've been flying, there has been construction along this ridge and extending out and out there too. And I also brought it up yesterday. It's something to think about with these folks, wherever you're looking. In places like this, especially in Persia and Babylon and Mosul and all the, you know, along the route we came, they always build down before they build up. All right. They don't talk about that in any of these battles. These all seem to been done above ground. But in modern times, when American troops have been going over there, as in Mosul, we had to go under the city. So that was confirmed. Yeah, looking down there. Well, I guess where I'm getting at with that is, you know, whenever you're looking at these things, you know, I keep in mind, like, I wonder if it's, you know, underground. What's going on underground? Under the ground. Hey, Henny says that Steam, let me read that. Steam has a discount again, and you can get the SU-33 or SU-27 for $7. Took the chance and bought the Mustang with the guns for 24 euros instead of 44. That's great. The Sumerian tablets get very Tolkien at times because they're doing genetic manipulation. They start a program here on Earth to develop a more suitable human that could become a king and or a ruler, or, you know, put in charge, a bureaucrat. So there was a program to create better or more Anunnaki-like humans. Again, Darius just comes from one of the factions, one of the rulers, and he was just a king of kings. And I really wish I could remember, you know, doing one reading of something 12 or more years ago. It's hard to remember. I definitely would like to revisit the Zachariah 6 and stuff, so I could get a better understanding. I'm sure somebody's already put YouTube videos together of it out there where, you know, they've got it all broken down in videos like this. I'll have to go ask the Kings and Generals channel if they've ever mapped or done the Anunnaki battles. I don't want to learn any more about human battles. I want to get to the whose family is in the right and whose family's in the wrong, and where are we today because of all of that. So, okay. That was the Persianization. So now the Battle of Hydaspes, 326 BC. And then they got Alexander's Last War. Okay.
All right, guys, so this
is the one about his grandma. I don't want to see your grandma. Stop. Killing me.
With the Kothan Valley secured, Alexander left Taxiles and pressed deeper into the subcontinent, making for the Hyphasis River. To do so, however, Alexander would have to pass through the territories of numerous Indian...
Okay. We've got our first bit of clue there. The Haspian River, what is it? Hyphasis. He says Hyphas... Well, listen to how he says it again. But let me look that up here.
However, Alexander would have to pass through the territories of numerous Indian kings, having to either defeat or subjugate them in order to protect his rear. This portion of Alexander's campaign, from Taxila to the Hyphasis, would prove to be one of the most difficult of Alexander's career. It brought his empire to its greatest extent, and was marked by one of his toughest yet most brilliant victories, but would also push his men to their most extreme breaking point. Your own victories are worth mentioning too, soon to come to pass in our sponsor, World of Warships. If you don't know already, World of Warships is a free-to-play naval combat...
The Baeus River, as it's known today, I think. Ancient Greeks called it Hyphasis. Plinius called it Hyphasis, an approximation of the Vedic Vipas. Other classical names are Aeneas, Passus, Babasus. In modern times, the river has also been called Bias or Bija. See what I mean? The names are always changing. It because of this constant name changing. That even makes things harder to get to the bottom of who's who and what's what, and these name changes. All right. Let's try to find out where this river's at now. So if you go to Wikipedia, you'll usually get a set of coordinates. If you click on that, it takes you to another page, which gives you a geo URL coordinates, and it's easier to copy that. And go back to the main menu. I don't know if it's a feature yet, and I haven't looked in here to be 100% certain. There is no way for me to do a search in here and for us to teleport from here to another location, which is a real drag. Maybe in developer mode. But to now move and do a teleport, we have to go back to the main menu. So we're going to need a way to do that other than going into developer mode. I don't want to muck about in there. Okay, now that we have that easy URL. Yeah, I'm glad we're not flying that. That was a big jump. Mark that. This is a crazy looking place. It's going to get creepy too. All the Hindu god stuff is crazy. The Bhagavad Gita and blah, 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 and the blah, blah, blah. And their stuff is insane. Their accounts of, to me, their accounts, all their gods are the same story that we're talking about. Again, names are going to change all over the place. Right? So count on 28 different name changes before we get to the bottom of oh, it was this guy that was part of the landing party from over here, blah, blah, blah. All right, so we made a jump from over here. Oops. Okay. Oh, you weren't seeing that?
To field hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Before confronting this empire, however, Alexander needed to subdue the numerous kingdoms that lay between the Taxila and Hyphasis in order to secure his rear. Emissaries had already been sent to the local kings, notably Abisares and Porus, requesting tribute and that they meet Alexander on the borders of their kingdoms. Abisares submitted to Alexander, but Porus, king of the Pauravas, was more stubborn. While little is known about Porus, it is clear from Greek sources that he was a formidable ruler. He was a renowned warrior, brave, strong, and standing an intimidating 7 feet tall, and his physical attributes were matched by his intelligence, Porus being described as a wise, cunning, and respected leader. In response to Alexander's request, Porus replied that he would indeed meet him on his border, but that he would bring an army with him. Never one to refuse a challenge, Alexander, amid the monsoon season, marched to the Hydaspes with a force of approximately 30 to 40,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry, and 5,000 Taxilian allies. On the opposite bank, they saw the Pauravas' army, 35,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, 300 chariots, and approximately 100 elephants. At their head, riding a large elephant, was Porus himself. Porus had chosen his battlefield well. The Hydaspes was wide and fast-flowing, meaning that any contested crossing, as Alexander had done at the Granicus, would be near impossible. He had further capitalized on his position by stationing his elephants in front of his battle line, knowing that their very presence would spook Alexander's horses and make any crossing even more difficult. Time was also on Porus's side. Abisares, though he had previously submitted to Alexander, had also promised to reinforce Porus. Alexander needed a quick victory, but with a frontal attack out of the question, a more cunning strategy would be needed. Alexander made his camp in clear view of Porus's men and sent out foraging parties. At the same time, he sent numerous scouting parties up and down the river, ensuring that they made plenty of noise while doing so. Porus in turn kept the majority of his force drawn up opposite Alexander's camp, but sent his own troops to mirror Alexander's scouts along the riverbank. The charade continued for days, Alexander's men bringing supplies into their camp and his scouting parties riding along the river with Porus's men mirroring their movements. Eventually Porus became convinced that Alexander would wait for the monsoon season to end and was only scouting for future landing spots, and stopped sending his men to parallel Alexander's movements. This was precisely what Alexander had been hoping for. Alexander had already identified his crossing point, approximately 18 miles upstream from his camp and densely wooded. The thick foliage had provided enough cover for Alexander's men to assemble rafts and boats in the area in preparation for his crossing. Alexander's feigned scouting missions hiding their movements. With these preparations made, and Porus lured into a false sense of security, Alexander made his move. He ordered the campfires to be kept burning, had his usual guard stationed outside his tent, had even dressed one of his companions as a double, and then, during the night, slipped away towards the crossing with 6,000 infantry, including phalangites, silver shields, hypaspists, Agrianians, archers, and 5,000 cavalry. Thanks to Alexander's numerous feints, any movement seen by Porus's army gave no concern. Craterus, meanwhile, was left in command of the majority of the army in camp, with Meleager and a force of mercenaries stationed between the camp and the crossing. The initial strategy was that Craterus's force would maintain the facade of the full army being encamped, Melega's force would act as a further distraction by threatening a crossing, while Alexander would make the real crossing in secret and surprise Porus's force, hoping to lure the elephants towards him. Craterus would then also cross and catch Porus's army in a pincer, Meleager crossing where possible to join the fight.
America's under attack.
Uh-oh.
100,000 opioid deaths.
Yeah, it's true.
Alexander's force prepared to cross. A thunderstorm swept through, threatening to derail the mission, but it soon died down, the heavy rain and cloud providing more cover for Alexander. His men crossed the Hydaspes to the assigned landing point. Upon completing the crossing, however, Alexander realized that he had made a mistake. What he had considered the opposite bank was in fact a large island, separated from Porus's bank by another channel of the river. As quickly as they could, Alexander's men brought the rafts and boats across the island to cross this channel, but by the time they made foot on the other bank, it was nearing dawn, and they were spotted by Porus's scouts before Alexander's force could properly assemble. Though Alexander's previous maneuvers had allowed him to cross unopposed, his plan had been based on him having the element of surprise, and that advantage was now lost. He would now have to face Porus's force head-on, with only a quarter of his army. Porus quickly sent 2,000 cavalry and 120 chariots under the command of his son to engage Alexander's force while they completed the crossing. To buy time for his infantry, Alexander sent his horse archers to engage the chariots, splitting his own cavalry into numerous squadrons to surround the Pauravas, and charged. Fortunately for Alexander, the heavy rain had made much of the terrain almost impossible for Porus's chariots to maneuver in, and his men quickly gained the upper hand, killing 400, including Porus's son, before they retreated to the main force. They had, nonetheless, delayed Alexander enough for Porus to make his own preparations. Leaving a small force to contest any crossing from Craterus, Porus turned the majority of his army to Alexander, cavalry and chariots on the flanks, infantry in the center, and with his elephants in front, intending to use them to break Alexander's infantry formation. With Porus's army drawn up for battle and Alexander's initial plan of surprising Porus shattered, he recalled his cavalry, waited for his infantry to catch up, and formulated a new strategy. Alexander knew that the elephants would be the biggest threat to his army, and so, rather than attack Porus's center immediately, he planned to crush Porus's cavalry on the flanks first. In order to do so, Alexander split his more numerous cavalry into two parts. The majority, under his personal command, would attack Porus's left, aiming to lure all the enemy cavalry to that side of the battle, which would allow the second part, under Coenus, to flank around Porus's right and attack the Pauravas' cavalry from the rear. The infantry, meanwhile, would advance slowly, but with strict orders not to engage until they saw that Coenus's movement had been successful. After giving his men time enough to recover their breath from the river crossing, Alexander began his attack, launching 1,000 horse archers at Porus's left. While the Pauravian cavalry was thrown into disarray by the storm of arrows, Alexander led his companions and the bulk of his cavalry around to hit their flank. Just as Alexander had planned, Porus diverted his cavalry from the right to reinforce his left. Coenus now made his move, flanking the Indian right and circling around to hit Porus's cavalry in the rear. The Pauravian horse, attacked from two sides, soon broke under the pressure, retreating towards the safety of the elephants in the center. Porus began to move his elephants to attack Alexander's cavalry to try and save his left, but Alexander's horses were easily able to pull back before the slower elephants could engage them. Meanwhile, Alexander's phalanx had now closed in on the Indian center, attacking the mass of infantry, elephants, and scattered cavalry. The elephants charged the phalanx, but Alexander had already prepared his men for fighting the beasts. Where possible, the phalanx gave ground to absorb their charge, thrusting their long sarissas at the mahouts or aiming for the elephants' eyes. Agrianians and light infantry were also sent against them, some attacking with javelins, some chopping at the elephants' trunks and legs with axes and swords. Nevertheless, the elephants caused heavy casualties, trampling many, picking up and throwing men with their trunks, and impaling others on their tusks. It was a scene of utter carnage. The elephants, though, many of whom were wounded and terrified, soon began to desperately try and escape the chaos, rampaging back through Porus's infantry and causing still more casualties. Alexander and the cavalry, meanwhile, kept attacking the sides and rear of Porus's center, until Porus's army was completely surrounded, the phalanx pushing from the front, Alexander and the cavalry from the rear, and the panicking elephants running amok in the middle. Under such fierce pressure, Porus's men gradually started to break, fleeing through the gaps in Alexander's cavalry. By this point in the battle, Craterus and Meleager had crossed the river with their portions of the army, pursuing the routing forces. Though some of the Pauravas had broken, others still fought on, Porus among them. Surrounded by his personal guard, he fought bravely for as long as any of his men did, throwing javelins from atop his elephant. He was wounded numerous times in the fighting though, at one point almost losing consciousness due to blood loss, and was eventually compelled by his men to retreat, the battle now clearly being lost. Alexander, however, had been impressed by Porus's determination and bravery, and sent men after him, compelling him to surrender. Wounded as badly as he was, it is debatable how much say Porus truly had. Nevertheless, he gave himself up and was brought to Alexander. Upon being asked how he wished to be treated, Porus famously replied, "Treat me as a king." His request was granted. Porus was treated by Alexander's best physicians and was allowed to rule as a vassal king under Alexander. Alexander later even gave more land to Porus to rule.
Now, a lot of people already that I've seen have had a big problem with that. Western historians are like, why would he do that? Doesn't make any sense. He wants to become the king of kings. But again, you know, there's not one king at this point. In the way I'm thinking he's starting to see things. Now, I could be wrong. I have no idea. But I'm guessing here, you know, when I listen to Western historians and like, this makes no sense. This guy basically almost destroyed Alexander, but Alexander is then going to, based on the way he's acted before, at this point, he's going to just say, hey, good fight. All right, yeah, you stay king of this area, and I'm going to give you more area because you're so darn cool. Right, the Hindu texts and the Hindu histories, you know, if it is to be believed, it's again all one big story that we're into here. And as we've seen just with these places alone, the names change constantly. So it's very, very difficult to, you know, I'm going to need one of those walls like detectives have with the strings all over the place. Like, okay, this person was this person. Over here, they were known as this person. And I'm going to have strings all over the room trying to sort out who is who. But I do believe he understands all this now. And he understands that, yeah, as cool as we are, we really are just, you know, Earth Kings. And that we're supposed to all rule, blah, you know, whatever. I don't know. Let's skip this if we can.
Provides balanced eating made simple.
They provide a new menu every week with delicious.
Let's find out.
The battle had been one of Alexander's masterpieces,
but
as it displayed
lost all kinds of people.
Psychological warfare, as well as feints and logistical knowledge, in effecting a crossing of more than 10,000 men in the night undetected. Once the initial plan had been foiled, Alexander also demonstrated his ability to devise a winning strategy under pressure and in moments. Arrian claims Alexander and Porus's losses as 310 and 23,000 respectively, while Diodorus suggests over 1,000 dead for Alexander, Porus suffering 12,000 dead and 9,000 captured.
That is that's kind of hard to believe. But, you know, the numbers throughout this whole campaign have been maybe. Okay. Real quick, we are right above that location now. I got us right over it. So, right. As I'm understanding, if I'm on the right side of the bank, the correct bank, then it's all of this decimated area where that battle took place. Kind of like in the Lord of the Rings when you see, you know, the characters running into elephants for the first time, being used as in war. Yeah, that must have been crazy. Other people are saying that the battle went the other way. It's almost like the guy making the video and the guy, this ruined area. Let me turn back around and show you the river out there. Either that or it was out there on that side. But according to the finder, the search, it put us right here. Okay.
Given the chaotic nature described in all the sources, particularly the role of the elephants, most modern historians tend to agree that Diodorus's figures are more realistic. Among Alexander's casualties was his horse, Bucephalus, who was either killed during the battle or died soon after, possibly
Mr. Bojangles.
Bucephalus had carried Alexander since boyhood, through numerous campaigns and battles, and his death affected Alexander deeply, the king even founding a city, Bucephala, in his honor. At this point, it is worth addressing the myth that Alexander in fact lost the Battle of Hydaspes to Porus. Proponents of this idea point to the fact that Bucephalus died, that Porus was kept as king, and that there are only Greek sources for the battle as evidence for this view. They also cite the account of Justin and the Alexander romance, both of which claim that Porus and Alexander duelled each other on the battlefield, Porus killing Bucephalus in this version. The arguments are weak. Justin's reliability leaves much to be desired, as his work is a summary of a previous, more detailed account, and varies wildly in its accuracy. The Alexander romance is even more problematic. Though some parts of it are rooted in historical sources, it was adapted by many cultures over centuries, eventually becoming more like a myth or fairy tale of Alexander's life than true history. The Alexander romance, for instance, claims that Bucephalus was a man-eating horse, that Alexander used 24,000 metal elephants at the Battle of Hydaspes, and that Porus used magicians in the battle. To no surprise, the text is largely considered unreliable. It is.
See, now they want to just dismiss it. They want to dismiss the fact that people are reporting metal elephants. What's a metal elephant? And that wizards were used in battle. But again, the Western mind says, come on, really? Are you going to go with the conspiracy theory? Right? Just today, when I was trying to quickly go over where did he see the UFOs, and I wasn't able to track it down. The first thing that pops up was, there's no way Alexander, discounting the fact that Alexander saw UFOs. How would you know? But the first thing I run into is a paper saying he didn't see anything. No, he couldn't have. Metal elephants? A tank? He's had access to all these amazing sites. Who knows what kind of bond technology he's picked up making his way here. Right? And wizards?
It's worth noting, however, that even though both Justin and the Alexander Romance mention Alexander dueling Porus, both sources record the battle as a victory for Alexander, and also add the incorrect but often overlooked detail that Alexander killed Porus during the battle. The other claims are equally easily disproved. While Greek and Roman sources are indeed the only extant sources for the battle, they are unanimous in recording that Alexander won. In comparison, we have no Persian sources for the Battle of Granicus, but such a lack of sources does not count as evidence that the battle was lost. Alexander keeping Porus as king aligns with Alexander's prior treatment of captured rulers and nobility. Mithranes, Mazaeus, Erasmes, Prataphernes, and Oxyates are all examples of men who directly fought against Alexander, but later surrendered and were either appointed to their previous positions or promoted. As for the death of Bucephalus, although it highlights how hard fought the battle was, the death of a steed says nothing about the fate of the rider, nor the conclusion of the battle. Alexander's Indian campaign did not stop after the Hydaspes, and he was able to push further into the country, further evidencing his victory. Porus was, by all accounts, a talented ruler and brave warrior, worthy of respect and admiration for the feats he really did perform, without needing exaggeration. Claims that Alexander lost the battle are not supported by any academic historian or classicist, and should be labelled what they are: poor history at best, rank propaganda at worst. Following the battle, Alexander advanced beyond the Hydaspes, accepting the surrender of numerous kings in the area, including Abyssares, giving much of their lands to Porus to govern as a vassal or satrap. The majority of the local peoples submitted to Alexander.
All right, just for a look at that stretch. When he leaves this battle, they show him heading towards the mountains, and I was scanning earlier, and it's like, where the heck are they? They're way out there. Everything's way out there where Alexander's concerned. And again, at this point, too, the world is opening up. You know, he's based on the maps that he was shown by Aristotle, you know, this was all approaching the end of the world. And to start getting out here and having access to maps potentially that could show you that, oh my gosh, it keeps going, and then it keeps going, and it keeps going, and it keeps going, and it keeps going. So where you thought the end of the world is not. So much bigger. All right, so let's find out where he's going, and then we'll teleport that way. Or it'll just start heading us that way. Well, we'll see. Depends on how far he jumps.
Notably, the Cathaeans, Oxydracians, and Malians resisted. After resting his army in Porus's lands, Alexander marched on the Cathaean capital of Sangala, alongside Porus and 5,000 of his men. After 3 days' march, Alexander arrived near the city, finding their army, at least 20,000 strong, stationed outside the city on a hill, surrounded by 3 makeshift walls of wagons. Alexander led the first wave of the attack, dismounted, and fought alongside his companions. They were able to overcome the first line of defenses relatively easily, but the second proved much more difficult. Eventually, though, Alexander's army was able to break through the defenses, forcing the Cathaeans to retreat into their city. The city proved to be too large for Alexander to completely encircle, instead deciding to assault the walls with siege towers. The fighting proved to be particularly difficult, with Alexander losing as many as 1,200 men dead or wounded, but he was ultimately successful. Alexander reportedly took 70,000 Cathaeans as prisoners and razed Sangala to the ground, possibly as revenge for the comparatively heavy casualties he sustained. For weeks, Alexander's army continued their march inland, suffering from various tropical diseases, snake bites, and other dangers, heading for the Hyphasis River. Beyond this river, Alexander had heard reports of nations such as the Nanda Empire, which had fertile lands and large populations, and were to...
So let me quickly stop there. I am in developer mode, and you can use it to, it seems, to hop around. So he, Stangala. Bring it out. All right. This is huge. So he took all this and is now moving on. Okay.
To be the target of Alexander's next phase of his campaign. He had been warned that these nations had colossal armies, totaling in the hundreds of thousands, as well as thousands of elephants. But Alexander was nevertheless determined to press on, confident that he and his army would be able to overcome them. Alexander, however, had made a mistake. He had misjudged the attitude of his army. At the Hyphasis River, they mutinied, refusing to march any further. It was not the first time that his men had shown signs of fatigue. Similar concerns had been voiced following the death of Darius, but this was the first time they had point-blank refused to go on. Alexander appealed to them, assuring them that the rumors they had heard regarding the Nanda armies were surely exaggerations. He listed the nations that he and his army had conquered, imploring men to press on further to complete his grand strategy of conquering all of Asia, saying, "Glorious are the deeds of those who undergo labor and run the risk of danger, and it is delightful to live a life of valor and to die leaving behind immortal glory." The speech was met with silence. Alexander encouraged any man to speak their mind, saying that anyone who disagreed could feel free to say so. Still, there was silence. Alexander had always been loved by his army, but the fate of Cleitus and Callisthenes, who had both spoken out against Alexander, was perhaps still too close a memory. Alexander grew angry and annoyed, declaring, "Alone I shall persist in going on. Expose me to the rivers, the beasts, and those nations whose mere names you dread. I shall find men to follow me, deserted though I am by you. Go then back to your homes. Go in triumph after having abandoned your king. Here I shall find the victory of which you despair, or the opportunity for an honorable death." Some of his men began to break down in tears upon hearing this, but still no one said a word. Finally, Coenus, one of Alexander's finest generals, who had recently distinguished himself at the Hydaspes, spoke up for the men. He firstly assured Alexander that he and the men would, in his words, "go wherever you order, to fight, to incur danger, at the price of our blood, to hand your name to future generations. If you persist, we, even unarmed, naked and worn out, will follow wherever you desire." Coenus then pointed out, however, that after years of campaigning, their armor and weapons were broken and tattered, and that many were now past their fighting prime. They had lost thousands of comrades over the years, some to battles, some to disease, some to the weather or wild animals. Those that were left, Coenus argued, had earned the right to return home and enjoy the glory and riches that Alexander had brought them. Coenus continued, pointing out that Alexander had already won eternal glory, and that he risked losing it all if he pushed on with an army that was starting to weaken. It would be wiser, he reasoned, for Alexander to return to Macedonia, rest his men, and then begin a new campaign with a fresh army. Coenus' speech was greeted with applause and cheers from the men. Furious, Alexander dismissed them and stormed off to his tent. He remained there for 2 days, hoping that the men's attitude would change. On the third, when it became apparent that they would not relent, Alexander emerged from his tent to perform his regular sacrifices. He proclaimed them to be unfavorable, saying it was a clear message from the gods, and that as a result, he would lead the men home. It was clearly a face-saving act from Alexander, designed to give him an excuse to agree to the men's demands without admitting defeat. But none cared. His men were overjoyed, greeting Alexander with tears and praises, and the latter reconciled with the army. To mark the extent of his campaign, Alexander ordered the construction of 12 large altars, one for each of the Olympian gods. Alexander's campaign, originating in Greece 10 years earlier, finally reached its limit at the Hyphasis River in Punjab. Alexander had, in Arrian's opinion, finally allowed himself to be defeated, not by an enemy, but by his own men. Alexander turned his army around and began the march back to the Hydaspes River. Shortly after this, Coenus died. Most sources say it was an illness that killed him, and no source makes any implication that Alexander was involved. Some modern historians, however, do consider it suspicious that Coenus died so soon after publicly disagreeing with Alexander, and suggest that Alexander may have had him killed as he had done with Callisthenes. Nevertheless, the army soon reached the Hydaspes, where a large fleet had been constructed to sail Alexander's army down the river in preparation for the journey home. However, although Alexander's campaign had reached its greatest extent, it was not yet over. The Malians and Oxydracians, who had previously resisted Alexander, inhabited land along the banks of the Hydaspes, and so long as Alexander had an army, there would always be more conquests. Thanks again to World of Warships for sponsoring this video. Get the game for free via our link in the description. The next episode of our series on Alexander is now in the works and will be released soon, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it.
Those guys are awesome. Like and subscribe. I'm trying to get things are really getting herky-jerky. I turned everything up too high. Okay. Now, what I wanted to say here is that we're turning back. We're in the location approximately, whereas people are supposedly have done all that. Where they are said to, I just bit my tongue. Where they are said to have done all that and forced them to turn back. A lot of people are like, that's crap, man. You know, why would he give up? You know, why wouldn't he at least just, you know, take a small entourage and just by himself keep going? I don't know. All right. If I was him, I'd have been like, all right, well, you know, who wants to go? Who wants to say, see ya, bye, go then. You know, go manage everything that we've just done so far. Go wherever you want in the places we just took and start making sure everything is running good. Okay? Bye. Everybody else is saying that he's now getting the full red pill. There's no way he potentially can survive the challenge of going forward. They're too smart. I mean, they're saying he, you know, defeated them handily. But at the same time, these are the worst battles he's ever had. It was easy going, you know, like a D&D adventure. He started out, he was dealing with, you know, level 1 fighters, level 2 fighters, and along the journey, everybody's been getting tougher and tougher and tougher. More tough, more tough, more tough. So he's now finally over here, and he's running into, you know, level 7 where his troops are at. So that's what, especially the Indian historians, the Indians are like, are you kidding? If he would have kept going, we would have wiped him out. Especially the Indian part of the Indian culture that is tied into like these Anunnaki, whatever they call their deities over there, these stories and the technologies that they had. Their records and accounts are smashing over there. But we in the Western world, I don't believe we still have a lot of the translations, but that's my own speculation. Okay, so basically now he's going to go back to... There are some more battles between here and there. So on the way back, he goes back cutting south, and he's going to knock out a couple more people. Yeah, there was one we skipped already. Alexander in Afghanistan. Ofen campaign. Then there was the Malian campaign. Reforms and plans. Last days of Alexander. 2 versions. Ancient history. Let me check out this one real quick. Find out where on the map they're at there.
With the Sogdian revolt crushed, Alexander, despite growing divisions in his army, set his sights beyond the borders of the Persian Empire and onto the Indian subcontinent. Motivated in equal parts by strategic and personal reasons, the Indian campaign, which took place mostly in modern Afghanistan and Pakistan, would prove to be one of Alexander's costliest, and may even have ultimately led to his death. In this episode, we will look at how his army's divisions culminated in one of the most serious attempts on his life, and discuss the opening, often overlooked, Coffin campaign. If you're liking our series on Alexander,
That's funny, I overlooked it. Let's kind of get to it. Yeah, his okay. I had mentioned how Parmenion was really cool. Parmenion was always on the left flank, and he always held his part and did his part, and his son was one of Alexander's best friends, right? And it all involves some sort of assassination plot that they tie into his friend and the father, and they both get taken out. It's nuts, man. But let me try to find out where they are at. 327. Give us a marker. Aragaeum. All right, so we've got a name. Let me grab that here. Coffin campaign Wikipedia. Coordinates. Short coordinates. Copy. So it looks like if I come up here, whoa. All I know is I would want to be on the tallest part of the mountain, that's for sure. Have you ever played Rome Total War? That's crazy. reset the camera. There we are. They're saying the battle took place right here. Man. Yeah, I guess you can also think too, getting up here, my lord, you know what? How are we going to keep going? So this was before they actually told him to turn back. He had already hit all this and went back. Remember last night? The blue roof? The blue roofs on buildings? That's been marked with a blue spot. What does it mean, Mulder? Means don't shoot it with the space laser and set it on fire. Burn everything else. Lost our aircraft. All right. This is right where it says it took place. So the only other thing I wanted to check was down here in this valley. If you squint, but it's, you know, Maybe something was there along through here. I don't know. But yeah, again, when you hit something like this, it's like, oh Lord, how can we even get through this? It goes forever and ever and ever. And we like the Mediterranean. Okay. Find out what's going on here.
Meanwhile, commanded the rest of the army and advanced to the center. The Goreans, only seeing Alexander's outnumbered part of the army, charged down from the high ground to attack Alexander's center. As they did so, Leonatus and Ptolemy advanced with their forces on the flanks. Ptolemy's flank faced particularly stiff resistance, but Alexander and Leonatus were having much greater success, and eventually, attacked on three sides, the Goreans broke, with Arrian claiming that 40,000 were taken prisoner, though it is unclear how accurate that figure is. Alexander pushed on into the lands of the Asakeni. They refused to give battle in the open, instead falling back to their cities, Alexander pursuing and preparing to lay...
Okay, now we're at a new location. MASSAGA. Massage? No, I don't want a massage. I don't have a wiki page for it. I've got a page for it. Let's see if they give us what the modern name is. No, it doesn't say any modern name here at all. All right, let's try it a different way. No, this place does not want to come up. After the conquest of the Aspasians along the Kunar in the winter, blah, 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 Alexander the Great crossed into the valley of the Swat, near modern Chakdara. He entered this beautiful country along a small, probably dry river, the Wuch, near modern Chakdara. The exact location of the ancient city of Masaga has not yet been established. Okay. Probably why nothing's coming up. But let's search the modern place they're talking about, Chakdara. Oh, the Khyber Pass. That sounds familiar. Is that where our forces were? Pull up. Oh no.
Pull up. Pull up. Pull up.
What? It put us in the middle of the water. No wonder the exact location is not known. What? Did I type in something wrong here? 34, 65. They weren't kidding. This is beautiful. This is absolutely beautiful. Yeah. The dry riverbed. There's a dry riverbed right out there. That's the first one that I see. So let's turn that way. Okay, several dry riverbeds in the area, but that's, you know, pretty much unmistakable. Oh, you can't see it. Look at how all this is terraced. All the paths up into the mountains. And we know that in the past, they, again, where we're coming from, they love building against the mountain and keeping, you know, the rear ends covered. All right.
A siege to their capital, Massaga. Massaga, however, had hired 7,000 well-trained and disciplined mercenaries to assist.
Which reminds me, looking at this game down here, I need to check when the Manor Lords is coming out. Should be getting closer to it. I really want to play that game.
Alexander approaching and encamping at the base. A local offered for a reward to show Alexander a path to an advantageous position, an offer Alexander gladly accepted, offering 80 talents. Following this guide, Ptolemy led the Agrianians, light infantry, and a few hundred hypaspists along a circuitous mountain path, avoiding detection by the enemy until they were in position on the western summit. When there, Ptolemy reinforced his position with a barricade and used fires to signal his success to Alexander. It seems that Alexander was planning to use the same tactics he had used at the Sogdian Rock, threatening to attack the Essakeni from two sides. He advanced with his main force the next day to attack, but the terrain proved too difficult and he was forced to withdraw. the Asakeni seized the opportunity and instead attacked the position of Ptolemy, trying to dislodge his force. Ptolemy's group was outnumbered, but well dug in, and fought back desperately, the fighting continuing throughout the day and only ending with nightfall. Ptolemy's force had managed to repulse the attackers, but the Asakeni did seem to have managed to keep a force in the area to overlook the mountain path Ptolemy had taken. With the initial plan having failed, Alexander changed tactics. A part of the army was left guarding the paths around the mountain to maintain the siege, while the rest of his army went up the path Ptolemy had taken and rejoined him. As they marched up this path, they were continuously harassed by arrows and stones, with many men being wounded and progress being slow. It may have taken as many as 2 days, but eventually Alexander's army gained the summit, reuniting with Ptolemy. However, ravines still made an approach to the fortress itself difficult. As a result, just as he had done at the Rock of Kerenes, Alexander ordered the construction of a bridge in order to get his siege weapons into position. Working day and night, his engineers began construction of the bridge, wooden screens being used to protect them as much as possible from enemy fire, and using his missile troops to hold off sallies from the Asakeni. After 4 days, the bridge was completed, and the engines were brought into position. The Asakeni, at this point, saw the writing on the wall. What happened next is not entirely clear. According to Arrian, the Asakeni offered peace terms, but then attempted to slip away the following night. Rufus, on the other hand, claims that for 2 nights, the Asakeni loudly beat drums and kept torches lit throughout the night, and then on the 3rd night, lit all the torches as usual and then tried to escape the fortress. Whichever was the case, Alexander discovered the attempt and ordered his men maintaining the siege to stand down, allowing the Asakeni to begin their retreat. He then rushed the fortress with 700 men, falling upon the Asakeni rear as they retreated, while the men guarding the base of the mountain simultaneously attacked. A significant number managed to escape, but the rest were captured and enslaved. Due to the contradictory nature of our available sources, it is not clear if this was yet another case of Alexander treacherously breaking a peace, or if he had seen through the ruse and predicted the withdrawal. With the fortress taken, the Kofen Valley was subdued, and Alexander marched to the Indus, reuniting with Hephaestion and Perdiccas, and crossed his whole army across the Indus using the pontoon bridge prepared for them. From here, he marched to the allied Taxila, receiving more allied local forces.
All right. Now, I may have the spot. I may be off a little bit, but there are definitely paths going up different mountains and all. What they talked about is call me up there on the top of the hill. So let me show you this here, looking down. Look at the circuitous path on this side, and obviously something major was up here. Okay, there's also this route here. It goes much higher into the mountain, but the only encampments then that are right tucked in, there's one down there. I've been looking for a bridge that he is claimed to have built. All right, there's that down there, but that doesn't seem to fit. Nothing really there. But keep going over the other ridge. There's that over there. I wish it would retain my settings better. Keeps lowering the drone speed back to default. Keep it where I put it. That doesn't seem like it had any lookout there. And I don't see anything like a bridge. Maybe. No real clear path on that side. So to me, this is the best thing that fits this description. You got the river right there nearby. They said he came in through the dry riverbed. There's the dry riverbed over there. And then he came in and had to deal with that front, but then had his guys sneak around into these mountain the mountain pass. Still don't know where that bridge is. Either way, we're in the right area. And then they're saying he finished up here and he's heading down to a place on the map now called Taxila. So let's grab that next and teleport. Punjab, Pakistan.
Pull up, 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 pull.
Did I miss? Did I chop that off?
Pull up.
33.
Pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up.
Wow. Look right below it. You can't see because of that darn window. Look at the lower half of the screen. That ancient, to me, that looks like an ancient city right there. Modern Punjab. Think about how tall that thing must be to cast a shadow like that. Okay, so back to Punjab.
Including elephants while doing so. At Taxila, he rested his men for a while and inquired about other tribes in the area. It was here that Alexander learned of two hostile local kings, Abiseres and Porus. The latter, who was the more powerful of the two, had amassed his army on the banks of the Hydaspes River, determined to halt Alexander's advance. Despite the monsoon rains, Alexander left Taxila and advanced in the spring of 326 to the Hydaspes. We will cover the famous battle that happened there in our next video, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without...
Okay, Battle of the Hydaspes. I found it. Got the coordinates. And let's get set up.
Pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up.
You and your pull up.
Pull up, pull up, pull
52.
pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up.
Yeah, that's right.
Pull up, 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 pull up.
So right now, this is farmland, but you see all that out in front of us there. See, we can see in the ground. Nah, it could just be farmland. We'll find out more in a moment where they were staging. Interesting structures. All right. For the battle, though, they have spawned us here. Let's find out now.
All right, guys, so this is the easy...
With the Kofan Valley secured, Alexander left Taxiles and pressed deeper into the subcontinent, making for the Hyphasis River. To do so, however, Alexander would have to pass through the territories of numerous Indian kings, having to either defeat or subjugate them in order to protect his rear. This portion of Alexander's campaign, from Taxila to the Hyphasis, would prove to be one of the most difficult of Alexander's career. It brought his empire to its greatest extent, and was marked by one of his toughest yet most brilliant victories, but would also push his men to their most extreme breaking point. Your own victories are worth mentioning too, soon to come to pass in our sponsor. Porus, it is clear from Greek sources that he was a formidable ruler. He was a renowned warrior, brave, strong, and standing an intimidating 7 feet tall, and his physical attributes were matched by his intelligence, Porus being described as a wise, cunning, and respected leader. In response to Alexander's request, Porus replied that he would indeed meet him on his border, but that he would bring an army with him. Never one to refuse a challenge, Alexander, amid the monsoon season, marched to the Hydaspes with a force of approximately 30 to 40,000 infantry, 7,000 cavalry, and 5,000 Taxilian allies. On the opposite bank, they saw the Pauravas' army, 35,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, 300 chariots, and approximately 100 elephants. At their head, riding a large elephant, was Porus himself. Porus had chosen his battlefield well. The Hydaspes was wide and fast-flowing, meaning that any contested crossing, as Alexander had done at the Granicus, would be near impossible. He had further capitalized on his position by stationing his elephants in front of his battle line, knowing that their very presence would spook Alexander's horses and make any crossing even more difficult. Time was also on Porus's side. Abisares, though he had previously submitted to Alexander, had also promised to reinforce Porus. Alexander needed a quick victory, but with a frontal attack out of the question, a more cunning strategy would be needed. Alexander made his camp in clear view of Porus's men and sent out foraging parties. At the same time, he sent numerous scouting parties up and down the river, ensuring that they made plenty of noise while doing so. Porus in turn kept the majority of his force drawn up opposite Alexander's camp, but sent his own troops to mirror Alexander's scouts along the riverbank. The charade continued for days, Alexander's men bringing supplies into their camp and his scouting parties riding along the river with Porus's men mirroring their movements. Eventually Porus became convinced that Alexander would wait for the monsoon season to end and was only scouting for future landing spots, and stopped sending his men to parallel Alexander's movements. This was precisely what Alexander had been hoping for. Alexander had already identified his crossing point, approximately 18 miles upstream from his camp and densely wooded. The thick foliage had provided enough cover for Alexander's men to assemble rafts and boats in the area in preparation for his crossing, Alexander's feigned scouting missions hiding their movements. With these preparations made, and Porus lured into a false sense of security, Alexander made his move. He ordered the campfires to be kept burning, had his usual guard stationed outside his tent, had even dressed one of his companions as a double, and then, during the night, slipped away towards the crossing with 6,000 infantry, including phalangites, silver shields, hypaspists, Agrianians, archers, and 5,000 cavalry. Thanks to Alexander's numerous feints, any movement seen by Porus's army gave no concern. Craterus, meanwhile, was left in command of the majority of the army in camp, with Meleager and a force of mercenaries stationed between the camp and the crossing. The initial strategy was that Craterus's force would maintain the facade of the full army being encamped. Meleager's force would act as a further distraction by threatening a crossing, while Alexander would make the real crossing in secret and surprise Porus's force, hoping to lure the elephants towards him. Craterus would then also cross and catch Porus's army in a pincer, Meleager crossing where possible to join the fight. With his plans in place, Alexander's force prepared to cross. A thunderstorm swept through, threatening to derail the mission, but it soon died down, the heavy rain and cloud providing more cover for Alexander. His men crossed the Hydaspes to the assigned landing point. Upon completing the crossing, however, Alexander realized that he had made a mistake. What he had considered the opposite bank was in fact a large island, separated from Porus's bank by another channel of the river. As quickly as they could, Alexander's men brought the rafts and boats across the island to cross this channel, but by the time they made foot on the other bank, it was nearing dawn, and they were spotted by Porus's scouts before Alexander's force could properly assemble. Though Alexander's previous maneuvers had allowed him to cross unopposed, his plan had been based on him having the element of surprise, and that advantage was now lost. He would now have to face Porus's force head-on, with only a quarter of his army. Porus quickly sent 2,000 cavalry and 120 chariots under the command of his son to engage Alexander's force while they completed the crossing. To buy time for his infantry, Alexander sent his horse archers to engage the chariots, splitting his own cavalry into numerous squadrons to surround the Pauravas, and charged. Fortunately for Alexander, the heavy rain had made much of the terrain almost impossible for Porus's chariots to maneuver in, and his men quickly gained the upper hand, killing 400, including Porus's son, before they retreated to the main force. They had, nonetheless, delayed Alexander enough for Porus to make his own preparations. Leaving a small force to contest any crossing from Craterus, Porus turned the majority of his army to Alexander, cavalry and chariots on the flanks, infantry in the center, and with his elephants in front, intending to use them to break Alexander's infantry formation. With Porus's army drawn up for battle and Alexander's initial plan of surprising Porus shattered, he recalled his cavalry, waited for his infantry to catch up, and formulated a new strategy. Alexander knew that the elephants would be the biggest threat to his army, and so, rather than attack Porus's center immediately, he planned to crush Porus's cavalry on the flanks first. In order to do so, Alexander split his more numerous cavalry into two parts. The majority, under his personal command, would attack Porus's left, aiming to lure all the enemy cavalry to that side of the battle, which would allow the second part, under Coenus, to flank around Porus's right and attack the Pauravas cavalry from the rear. The infantry, meanwhile, would advance slowly, but with strict orders not to engage until they saw that Coenus's movement had been successful. After giving his men time enough to recover their breath from the river crossing, Alexander began his attack, launching 1,000 horse archers at Porus's left. While the Pauravian cavalry was thrown into disarray by the storm of arrows, Alexander led his companions and the bulk of his cavalry around to hit their flank. Just as Alexander had planned, Porus diverted his cavalry from the right to reinforce his left. Coenus now made his move, flanking the Indian right and circling around to hit Porus's cavalry in the rear. The Pauravian horse, attacked from two sides, soon broke under the pressure, retreating towards the safety of the elephants in the center. Porus began to move his elephants to attack Alexander's cavalry to try and save his left, but Alexander's horses were easily able to pull back before the slower elephants could engage them.
Emma, I think I've just majorly screwed up moving around. I thought that maybe I think this is where we opened with. I'm like, this river seems a little bit familiar. Didn't we do this already? And I think we have. I think I just went full circle in some way. Or did everything out of order. I'm like, I swear we've seen this. Where he sweeps around and takes him this way, crosses the river. All this crazy looking stuff. Not certain. It's all starting to get a little bit jumbled. Let's find out what happens after this. Let's get to it, though.
Meanwhile, Alexander's phalanx had now closed in on the Indian center, attacking the mass, running amok in the middle. Under such fierce pressure, Porus's men gradually started to break, fleeing through the gaps in Alexander's cavalry. By this point in the battle, Craterus and Malega had crossed the river with their portions of the army, pursuing the routing forces. Though some of the Pauravas had broken, others still fought on, Porus among them. Surrounded by his personal guard, he fought bravely for as long as any of his men did.
Yeah, we did, because this is all. Yeah, we did. Yeah, because now we're back to Porus again. How in the heck did we get that off course?
Following the mutiny of Alexander's army at the Hephaestus sometime in the autumn of 326 BC, one would be forgiven for thinking that this marked the end of his campaign, that, as he had promised his men, he would begin the journey home. However, this was not the case. Instead, Alexander planned to campaign in the Indian subcontinent for almost a year longer, sailing down the Indus in pursuit of his long-held dream of reaching the ocean and fighting local tribes en route before making for Babylon. On the face of it, such tasks may have seemed straightforward, but this part of the campaign would prove to be one of the most grueling of Alexander's career, costing him the most losses for his army and nearly his own life. This chapter of Alexander's story is about pushing through chaos and uncertainty, something we'll all have to do in the coming year, and rejoining Craterus, who had been left behind with a portion of the army to construct a fleet. In the few months that Alexander had been away, Craterus and his men had been remarkably productive, managing to construct 38 galleys, as well as hundreds of smaller vessels, numbering as many as 1,000 or 2,000 according to some ancient sources. At this same time, Alexander also received fresh men, likely from Greece, Babylon and Thrace, consisting of 30,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, along with 25,000 new suits of armor and medical supplies, all of which were badly needed. With his army refreshed and resupplied, Alexander began his voyage. Nearchus, his childhood friend, would command the armada, which would also carry Alexander, the Hypaspists, archers and companions. Craterus, meanwhile, was given command of part of the infantry and cavalry on the left bank, while Hephaestion commanded the rest of the force on the right bank. Both would march along the river in tandem with the fleet, acting as scouts and clearing any potential enemies. Alexander's division of his forces like this also served another purpose, however. Throughout his campaigns, court politics had become a bigger and bigger issue, with various generals beginning to feud with one another.
As we do.
Hephaestion and Craterus were two particularly noteworthy examples of this. Hephaestion enjoyed a particularly close relationship with Alexander, and as the campaign continued, he was entrusted with more and more responsibilities, consistently demonstrating himself to be a loyal and competent subordinate and a talented cavalry commander. Craterus was also greatly prized by Alexander, and throughout his campaign, Alexander regularly chose Craterus to be his primary defensive general, often entrusted with holding crucial strongpoints, such as the camp at the Hydaspes. The rivalry between Hephaestion and Craterus was well known, and at one point they had actually drawn swords against each other over a dispute regarding Alexander's Persianization, forcing Alexander to intervene personally. Alexander's division of his forces while sailing the Hydaspes was therefore not only a strategic decision, but also a shrewd move to separate the two feuding commanders. The army organized accordingly, Alexander set sail, making for the lands of the Oxydracians and Malians, two people who had not yet paid tribute to him, and were rumored to be preparing for war. As the army moved down the Hydaspes and Acacenes rivers, they received the submission or surrender of a number of local tribes and cities, such as the Scythians, the majority not putting up a fight. When a tribe refused to submit, Alexander would disembark and gather his forces to storm their city. One such tribe was the Agalaceus, who put up fierce resistance, the resulting battle ending in the burning of their city, either accidentally or on Alexander's orders, before being conquered.
So sorry about your city.
Besides these pockets of resistance, at the confluence of the Indus and the Acacenes, the fast-flowing rivers wreaked havoc amongst his fleet, some ships smashing together, and Alexander losing two of the larger ones. At one point, according to some sources, Alexander's own ship almost succumbed to the torrents, forcing him to strip off his armor and dive into the water in order to swim to safety.
Are you still using Google?
Yeah.
I have something to show you.
No. I want to remain ignorant. I don't want to see anything new. Especially when you talk in a strange foreign accent. You fuzzy man.
These dangers, the majority of the fleet and the army successfully reached Malian territory sometime in late 326 BC. The Malians and Oxydracians were traditionally enemies, But upon hearing of Alexander's planned approach, they had formed an alliance in order to stop the invader. However, Alexander's rapid advance down the river meant that his enemies had not been able to properly combine their forces. As a result, Alexander decided on a blitzkrieg-esque strategy to quickly conquer the Malians before the two forces could unite. To achieve this, he split his army into a number of parts. Alexander, with approximately 6,500 infantry, including the Hypaspists, archers and Agrianians, and 2,000 cavalry of companions and horse archers, was to attack from the north. Craterus would advance down the west bank of the river, while Hephaestion would march quickly down the east bank. Ptolemy was given another detachment and ordered to wait 3 days before advancing, while Nearchus would sail down the river to the borders of Malian territory. With this strategy, Alexander planned to take the Malians by surprise, attacking from multiple directions and forcing them to either retreat deeper into their territory, where they would be caught by Hephaestion's force or Nearchus's fleet, or forced to flee north, where Ptolemy would intercept them. It was an excellent example of how Alexander was not only a gifted tactician, but also a talented strategist. Nevertheless, his men were initially and understandably reluctant. Alexander had promised them that they would be returning home, but rather than halting his campaign, Alexander had simply diverted the campaign in a different direction. There was once again talk of mutiny, but Alexander was, on this occasion, able to quickly subdue the problem. He reassured the men that this campaign would be swift and straightforward, but still with the promise of plenty of glory and plunder, and that the ocean, the current aim of Alexander's ambition, was close. His men's grievances handled, the campaign began. It was a quick affair, Alexander marching 50 miles in just under 2 days and subduing all the Malian towns west of the Hydraortes in just 7 days. However, it was also as ruthless as it was quick, Alexander's men killing any who resisted, including holy Brahmins. Perdiccas, with cavalry and light infantry, was dispatched from Alexander's force and sent to subdue other cities and chase down any fugitives to stop word of Alexander's advance spreading. The other portions of Alexander's army had been just as ruthlessly efficient, forcing many Malians to retreat to their capital. Leading expert on the history of ancient Macedonia, Albert Bosworth, described it as a conquest through terror, and although it is possible to explain Alexander's tactics as a grim necessity in order to end the campaign quickly and decisively, motivated by the men's recent talks of mutiny and the need to secure supply lines, it is also impossible to avoid the reality that the Malian campaign was one of Alexander's most brutal. The strategy had nevertheless been successful in conquering much of the Malian territory, and Alexander now gathered his force to march on their capital. Initially, it seemed as if it would fall as quickly as many other places had to Alexander's army, his men quickly seizing the city. However, the attack stalled when the men tried to breach the citadel. To inspire his men to continue the attack and keep up the momentum, Alexander scaled a siege ladder himself, mounting the battlements. His men were invigorated by this display of bravery, the Hypaspists swarming the ladders behind him. However, under the weight of so many men, the ladders broke, leaving Alexander stranded on the battlements with only Leonatus, one of his 7 personal bodyguards, and Pacestus and Abraeus, 2 officers who had previously distinguished themselves in battle. Alexander quickly realized they would be easy targets for archers inside if they stayed atop the battlements, and were in mortal danger. Determined to die fighting, Alexander jumped from the battlements into the citadel, closely followed by the others. Fierce fighting broke out when the Malians realized that they had Alexander himself trapped and attempted to swarm the 4. It was a desperate affair, Alexander fighting with his back to a tree, the 4 men attempting to fend off any attackers that came close. Abraeus was cut down in the fighting, leaving only Leonatus and Pacestus carrying the shield of Achilles to protect Alexander. In the chaotic fighting, a Malian archer managed to shoot Alexander, the arrow piercing his ribs and probably puncturing a lung. Alexander was forced to his knees, coughing up blood. Pacestus placed the shield of Achilles over Alexander to protect his body, and together with Leonatus, prepared to defend him to the last. The rest of Alexander's army had, fortunately, not been idle. As soon as they had seen their king jump from the battlements, they had been seized by a kind of desperate frenzy, launching themselves at the citadel's gates. Smashing their way through, they fought their way through the defenders to search for Alexander. Upon seeing his body in a pool of blood, they lost all control, massacring any Malians left in the city in revenge. With the city taken, Alexander was taken from the battlefield for surgery to remove the arrow. Due to the arrow being barbed, it required a deep incision to be made to pull it out, and the combined blood loss of the initial wound and the operation almost killed Alexander. He did, however, survive, but spent days almost completely bedridden, and it is still debated whether he ever completely recovered from the wound. It had been a remarkable display of Alexander's bravery or foolhardiness, depending on opinion. While the sources do disagree on the names of some of the individuals involved, Bukestus's involvement is certain and common across all the sources. In recognition for his bravery, Alexander expanded the ranks of his personal bodyguard to 8 in order to incorporate him, and he would later ensure that Bukestus was assigned one of the richest provinces of the empire.
It's a fact. In the new economy, it's never been easier to create
While soldiers, rumor had spread that Alexander had died. Some were worried about who would command the army in his absence, others doubting whether they would be able to make it home without him. On numerous occasions, the generals tried to reassure the men, and Alexander even wrote a letter to be dispersed among his men, but they refused to believe any of it. Alexander instead ordered that he be taken by ship past the camp at such a distance that they would recognize him, but not close enough that they could see how weak he currently was. A wave from his hand was enough to calm the men. His generals, however, are said to have been relieved about his recovery, but also rather critical of Alexander, reprimanding him for being so reckless, lamenting the fact that he almost died taking, in the grand scheme of things, a rather nondescript city thousands of miles from home while still so young, and urging him to stay out of the fighting more in the future. Alexander thanked them for their concern, but claimed that he measured his life not in years, but in victories, saying, "I am bound to desire an abundant life rather than a long one. I will meet, unterrified, the hazards of war and Ares." In approximately spring of 325, after spending weeks recovering, Alexander was eventually well enough to travel again. In the time that he'd spent recovering, word of the Malian defeat had reached the Oxydracians, who quickly submitted without fighting as a result. Alexander's blitzkrieg strategy had proved to be a complete success. With the two peoples subdued, Alexander and his army once again journeyed down the Acacinis and Indus, aiming for the ocean. Many of the cities en route submitted passively, Alexander only facing light resistance for the most part. However, in many of these cities that did submit, the Brahmins, who were advisors as well as religious figures, often stirred dissent and rebellions behind Alexander, forcing him to send men back to crush the revolts and execute the Brahmins. It would not be the last time that these holy men would prove a problem for him. Upon reaching Patala, Alexander sent many of the older veterans as well as roughly 4 These factors forced Alexander to move his army to always encamp a certain distance away from water when it was found, putting even more strain on the already deteriorating force. For 60 days, the army suffered through the desert, before finally reaching the safety of Pura, where they could rest and recuperate.
Factor provides balanced eating made simple.
They provide a new menu.
Sorry about that. I had to run away from my computer for a minute, so if there was another commercial in there and I missed it. Sorry about that.
Or left as garrison forces in conquered regions, such as that under Leonatus. It is also hard to discern how many deaths were sustained by Alexander's military forces, and how many were camp followers. Modern historians continue to debate what the most likely figure is, and as of yet there is no consensus on the matter. What does seem apparent is that Alexander lost more men marching through the desert than in any of his battles, and so at the very least, his losses were likely in the thousands. Whatever the true number, Alexander's decision to march through the desert is widely regarded as his greatest mistake. Alexander's arrival at Pura effectively marked the end of his Indian campaign. It had been a series of low and high points in his career. On the one hand, the campaign had stretched his men's morale almost to breaking point at the Hephaestus, had used some particularly brutal tactics, had resulted in the deaths of potentially thousands of men marching through the Gedrossian desert, and had resulted in a wound that had almost killed Alexander, and may well have been a contributing factor to his early death. Furthermore, the Brahmins, a constant thorn in Alexander's side while in India, continued to lead revolts throughout territories taken by Alexander, ultimately resulting in many of them being abandoned by Hellenic forces over the next few years and being absorbed into the Mauryan Empire under Chandragupta. On the other hand, Alexander achieved arguably his most impressive military victory at the Hydaspes, had shown his incredible strategic talent during the Malian campaign, taking the empire to its greatest extent, completed his lifelong dream of reaching the ocean, and opened up the Indian subcontinent to the Hellenic world, an achievement that would have deep and far-reaching implications. Alexander would spend the next year consolidating his empire, attempting to create even deeper ties between his Hellenic and Persian subjects, and planning future campaigns. But his Indian campaign would prove to be his last. In just under 2 years, he would be dead. We will cover these plans, his return to Babylon, and his ultimate final days in the coming episodes. So make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to
Crazy. Okay.
Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links down in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord.
Wanna know why secret beats degree?
All right. So now he's got a slog all the way. I mean, he's basically right here. That's the best. That's my best guess on that. I'm looking at this point here and then coming out. So he's up in here somewhere. But he's still in over the next, what, I don't know how long it would have taken from here, but he's got to at least get to the capitals. This is old Persepolis again, over in this area. And then getting back to Babylon.
Alexander's journey from his days as a young king in Macedonia to being the king of kings of an empire that spans...
No, he is a king of kings.
In this episode, we shall examine Alexander's last journey from Pura to Babylon. This year, rather than displaying any of Alexander's military talents, would instead put the focus more on his personality and governorship. It would also throw his ongoing Persianization into the foreground again, and would culminate in one of Alexander's most devastating personal blows. One way to win popularity in today's world would be using beauty devices. So make it happen for yourself or someone in highest form, satrap and rank and file alike, appointing hand-picked governors where necessary. More worryingly still, Alexander had been brought reports that back in Europe, serious divisions had begun to form between Antipater, who Alexander had left in command of the region, and Olympias and Cleopatra, Alexander's mother and sister respectively. Though Alexander could have no way of knowing it, this rift would, in the long term, prove to be disastrous for his empire. Around the same time, Alexander proclaimed his so-called dissolution decree, which ordered all mercenaries his satraps and generals hired to disband. He was likely motivated by the worry that corruption and disobedience may eventually develop into complete rebellion, but the decree would be a thorn in his side. Though many mercenaries were shipped to Greece, many were also left roaming the empire, well armed and unpaid, a problem Alexander would later have to address. Upon leaving Pura, Alexander and his army made for Camanea. According to some sources, he turned the 7-day march into a kind of Dionysiac celebration, his men drinking and dancing as they marched, Alexander himself dressed as Dionysus atop a makeshift chariot. Arrian, who often takes a more favorable view of Alexander, doubts the veracity of this story. At the same time, Rufus, who rarely missed a chance to indulge in such anecdotes, wrote, "A mere 1,000 men, if sober, could have captured this group on its triumphal march." The truth of the tale can be debated, however the story does touch on an undebatable detail. As the campaign continued, Alexander more and more closely linked himself with the gods. Though Arrian had doubts regarding this particular episode, there were many other occasions where Alexander either dressed or styled himself as a deity. For some in his army, this was palatable or even welcomed, and his Persian subjects, who had always viewed their king as a divine being, saw no issue with it. However, the others in the army, likely the older men who had fought alongside him for years, were growing increasingly frustrated with it, a division that would soon come to a head. Alexander and his force reached Salamis, the capital of Carmania, sometime in the winter of 325. While there, Nearchus joined Alexander, successfully returning from his 60-day voyage across the Makran coast. Yet another celebration was held, with Nearchus regaling an enthralled Alexander with tales of his journey. Though this expedition had been largely exploratory, it had also served another purpose of being a training exercise. Alexander was already developing plans for his next great campaign. Nearchus's fleet managing to sustain themselves without needing an accompanying land army would be a crucial...
I did not know he crossed.
After resting in Salamis, Nearchus was once again sent out by Alexander, this time towards the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, where they would begin preparations for the next phase of Alexander's conquests. At the start of 324 BC, Alexander moved to the capital of Persis, Pasargadae, where he once more decided to visit the tomb of Cyrus the Great. To Alexander's fury, he found the tomb desecrated, with Cyrus's skeleton scattered on the floor. Alexander had long considered Cyrus a king worthy of his respect, possibly even an outright inspiration. Outraged, Alexander had the guards of the tomb tortured for information on the perpetrator, but learnt nothing, and had the satrap of Persis, Auxenes, executed for negligence. As his replacement, Alexander appointed Perkestus, a man who had fought bravely to protect him in Malia. He also ordered that the tomb be renovated and improved by his chief engineer, and that Cyrus's body be restored with full honors. The army once again moved on, heading to the old ceremonial capital of Persepolis. Here they once again celebrated with a huge drinking party. According to ancient sources, the Macedonians drank so heavily that no less than 36 men died of alcohol poisoning.
Oh my lord.
The reports of such excessive drinking parties in the sources became more and more regular as Alexander's campaign progressed, particularly in the latter years. This would, in all likelihood, prove to be yet another problem, which would soon be tragic for Alexander. Shortly after, Alexander marched his men to Susa, where he undertook several important administrative tasks. As mentioned earlier, Alexander's dissolution decree left many...
I'm going to pause right there. It's actually listed in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So let me speed up the drone again and backtrack a little bit. I was wrong. I was thinking that this was... I got these two places mixed up. I was getting Persepolis and this place mixed up. Pasargadae, something like that. So earlier, I had that wrong. I made a lot of mistakes. But hey, live and learn, right? Okay, there's the Tomb of Cyrus. This is who they're talking about. Now, Cyrus the Great. So again, a human king put in charge by the Anunnaki. All right, now he's back out in the water again. So he went there. I didn't realize he had crossed the water, but he did. And now he is heading to
his empire and causing trouble. As with the Gordian knot, Alexander used a pragmatic solution to a complicated problem. He issued the Exile Decree, which ordered all Greek exiles, including mercenaries, to return to their home cities, except the most serious criminals. Many Greek cities protested this decree, but Alexander made it clear that Antipater had the authority to use force on any who refused to uphold it. While this did help ease the mercenary problem, Alexander also had other motives. Reports from Europe about rumors of dissent among the Greek city-states had concerned Alexander. However, by publishing this decree, Alexander ensured that the Polis would have an influx of people, many of whom would have been politicians exiled by their opponents, who would owe him their loyalty thanks to being repatriated. While in Susa, Alexander once again heard reports on the performance of his satraps, executing those who had abused the citizens they were governing, replacing those that were unsatisfactory, and rewarding those who were. Around this time, Alexander carried out the famous Susa weddings. Polygamy was an accepted practice in Macedonian society, and so, despite already being married to Roxana, Alexander married once again, this time to Statera, a daughter of Darius III, while Hephaestion was wedded to another of Darius's daughters. Alexander and Hephaestion had always been close, and
this map had thrown me off. Okay, so we're there, but now he's already back to Babylon. Yeah, the way they have things drawn in there. I was getting the water all mixed up and everything spun around in my head and... Okay. So, let's teleport again to Babylon.
Pull up, 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 pull up.
What are you worried about? We got plenty of height.
Pull up, pull up, pull up, pull up.
Okay, so we're back to the site of ancient Babylon. Near current day Baghdad, out there. And then Baghdad. Okay. So back out approximately, well, we're back out to the area. So all this territory.
This marriage ensured their descendants would now be family. These marriages may also reveal that Alexander was concerned that the governing of some of his satraps had resulted in discontent among the Persian populace, and that he felt a need to strengthen his position. These were not the only marriages, however. many of Alexander's companions, perhaps as many as 90, were married to powerful Persian women, many of whom would have been linked to the Achaemenid family, all given handsome dowries from Alexander. At the same time, 10,000 of the rank and file who had married Asiatic women were registered and given presents by the king. The marriages of Alexander, Hephaestion and the companions all took place on the same day in a mass wedding done in the Persian style. Alexander personally paid off the debts of his soldiers, costing him approximately 20,000 talents, according to the ancient sources, worth as much as a staggering $28 billion today. While many were happy to have their debts paid and marriages registered, some, particularly among the companions, were less happy with being effectively forced to marry Persian women. Notably, out of all the future diadochi of Alexander who were married on this occasion, only one, Seleucus, stayed married to their given wife. Alexander's motive for these marriages has been and is still much debated. On the one hand, some historians, such as Tarn from the 1930s, share the view of Plutarch that Alexander was attempting to unify the two people of Europe and Asia to create a kind of brotherhood of mankind. In this interpretation, Alexander hoped to set a precedent of unity, so it was essentially a humanist act. Conversely, more modern historians like Badian and Worthington view these marriages as a purely pragmatic act. Rather than hoping to create a unity of humankind, they argue that Alexander was more concerned with diluting the Persian royal bloodline so that none could proclaim himself as a Persian king. Moreover, in their views, Alexander was hoping that the unions would result in a ruling class of mixed Macedonian-Iranian people who would not be seen as foreign conquerors, making governance easier. There is also a big question of how coerced some of these marriages were. While there may have been some among the companions and their wives who were happy with the marriage, others were likely forced into marriages. The Persian women in particular, though we have no source that gives their views, may have been none too pleased with the idea that they were being married off to men who, no matter how Alexander wished to portray things, were their conquerors.
We, the people of the United States.
We've moved so far away from the Constitution that in many ways we don't even recognize.
Alexander undertook the most significant steps towards integrating more Persians into his army. Men from Arachosia, Bactria and Sogdiana were incorporated into the companions, while the royal guard and 30,000 young Persians trained in the Macedonian style were absorbed into the army. Once again, the question of Alexander's motive is debated. Some view it as another attempt to create a unity of nations, while others view it as yet another solely pragmatic step intended to form the base of a new army to replace the many men who had either died, been wounded, or were now too old to fight. Although some of Alexander's army accepted and welcomed these changes, many were frustrated. Alexander's Persianization had been a sticking point for many of his men for years, and this increase of Persians into the army pushed them to their breaking point. Alexander marched his army from Susa into Mesopotamia in the summer of 324. At the Opis River, he announced that as many as 10,000 veterans and wounded would be sent back to Greece with full pay and rich rewards. This seemed a sensible suggestion given the army's previous mutiny at Ephesus. To Alexander's surprise, however, the men rebelled once again. Frustrated with Alexander's personal Persianization, his divine pretensions, and viewing themselves as being replaced by Persians, they demanded that he send them all home and continue with his father Zeusamon and his Persian war dances. Alexander's reaction to this was far more dramatic than at the Hephasis. Infuriated, he pointed out 13 men he considered the main agitators and had his hypaspists execute them immediately. He then harshly rebuked the men, listing Philip's achievements, his own, and what they had done for Macedonia. Arrian has Alexander saying, "The wealth of the Lydians, the treasure of the Persians, and the riches of the Indians are yours, as is the outer sea. You are satraps, generals, and captains. What have I reserved for myself after all these labors, except this purple robe and diadem? Whoever has wounds, let him strip and show them, and I will show you mine in turn. For there is no part of my body, at least on the front, free from wounds. Depart, all of you. Go back and report home that you deserted your king and went away, handing him over to the protection of foreigners. Begone!" As with almost all speeches recorded in ancient sources, it is hard to discern how much of this was Arrian's creation or Alexander's actual speech. Nevertheless, other sources, though giving slightly different speeches, all touch on similar themes, and it is likely that Alexander truly did feel these sentiments. It is possible to view Alexander's speech as self-aggrandizing, as he lauded his and his father's achievements and tried to shame the men who had helped him achieve such feats by lauding their accomplishments as his alone. However, an argument can also be made that Alexander was justified in what he was saying, even if he was rather arrogant. Alexander was a significant factor in the army's success, and he had suffered alongside his men and rewarded them generously. Alexander's frustration at them for not sharing his ambition is as understandable as his men's frustration with Alexander for making them feel alienated. As at the Hyphasis, however, his words had little immediate effect on the men, and Alexander stormed into his tent, remaining there for 2 days. Rather than offering the hand of reconciliation as he had done previously, Alexander doubled down on his position. He replaced senior Macedonian officers with Persians. More Persians were inducted into the most honored units, including the Companions and Silver Shields. Alexander's stance was clear. His vision of the new Persian Hellenic army was happening, and the men either had to put up with it or leave. Shamed, his men begged him for forgiveness, and Alexander reconciled with them tearfully. Alexander's epic speech has since been lauded as the turning point of the mutiny. But while the speech is inspiring, powerful, and beautiful, it was not what convinced the men. It was Alexander's understanding of what kind of pressure he could apply that stopped the mutiny, and crediting the speech alone with Alexander's success underestimates his cunning. Hundreds of years later, and likely inspired by Alexander, Julius Caesar would use a similar tactic against one of his mutinying legions, dismissing them and telling them he would go on without them with similar success. Alexander held a huge feast to celebrate the reconciliation, sitting the Macedonians with the Persians and offering prayers for the unity of the two people. He continued with his original plan, sending approximately 10,000 veterans and wounded back to Macedonia under the command of Craterus. The latter was ordered to replace Antipater as regent of Europe, while the aging Antipater was ordered to join Alexander with a further 10,000 reinforcements. This move would, in theory, give Alexander a reliable and trusted general in Europe, while bringing Antipater, who had been in confrontation with Olympius, closer to Alexander for him to keep an eye on. Neither of these plans, however, would come to fruition. Alexander marched to Ecbatana, where he once again held a large celebration in honor of Dionysus, with much drinking and partying. At this point, in October of 324 BC, Hephaestion developed a
So now he's moving again. He's going back to Ecbatana. Oh my goodness, dude. You're all over the place. Going everywhere but home. Ecbatana. This is right. This is where he thought he was going to catch Darius. Darius moved on, and then that other gentleman killed him. Bosses. That doesn't seem right. Was this the really cool spiral city? I think it was, yeah. We were just looking at a lot of spirals. I think if this is one, but I don't think this is. I don't think this is the one. Maybe the one that we looked at last night seemed way better put together than this. Okay, so he's here now for the festival of Dionysus. Dionysus is he's a drinking deity. And associated with women, well, it's associated with everybody, but there we go with the blue roofs again. Stories about the men and the women that follow him, especially the women, that lose themselves so completely that, you know, they'll kill children, they'll kill their own children. You know, that's really the wicked downside to the Dionysian festivals. This is neat. The Bacchanalia, right? Okay, so he's here to get hammered.
Fever. Glaucus, his doctor, cared for him, and at first, Hephaestion appeared to be on the
Oh, and he's got a fever.
However, one day, while feeling better, he drank a large amount of wine and fell severely ill once again. Alexander was summoned and immediately rushed to his companion's side, but by the time he got there, Hephaestion was already dead.
Oh, it was Hephaestion.
Had been one of Alexander's closest friends.
Oh, yeah.
The two men had known each other since boyhood, and some speculate had even been lovers. The truth in the latter claim can be debated, but it is undoubtedly true that the two men were very close. Hephaestion had fought alongside Alexander for years, mainly as the commander of his 7-man bodyguard, and was one of Alexander's most dependable subordinates. He was often entrusted with delicate diplomatic missions, as well as his military duties, and eventually effectively became Alexander's right-hand man. Hephaestion, because of his closeness to Alexander, seems to have made many of Alexander's other commanders somewhat jealous, so it is unlikely that they were moved by his death. Alexander, on the other hand, was devastated. There are many versions of what Alexander did in the immediate aftermath. Some say that he immediately had Glaucus, Hephaestion's doctor, executed, that Alexander lay crying on Hephaestion's body throughout the night, that he decreed Hephaestion should be honored as a hero with sacrifices, and more.
Oops.
Arrian, who reports many of these stories, admits he is unsure which are true and which are not. He is right to be cautious. Many historians in ancient times were moralists who viewed their subjects as moral exemplar. As a result, some may have exaggerated Alexander's grief to highlight his humanity, others to highlight his lack of restraint. Nevertheless, Arrian does say that all sources he came across agreed that Alexander refused to eat for 3 days, and ordered days of public mourning and a funeral costing thousands of talents. The exact manner in which Alexander showed his grief can be disputed, but the extent of that grief cannot be. He was truly heartbroken. After weeks of depression, his companions managed to coax him back into action, and Alexander conducted a brief expedition against the Cossians, a small mountain tribe that was quickly overwhelmed. This brief footnote in his career would prove to be his last military action. He marched his army to Babylon, where he planned to oversee preparations for the next campaign. En route, he experienced several grim omens. A group of Chaldean philosophers begged him not to enter the city, prophesying that he would die if he did. Crows had fallen dead at his feet while he walked, and when he was sailing the marshes around Babylon, a branch caught his diadem, leaving him crownless. Most ominously of all for Alexander and his companions, after they had been exercising and Alexander returned to the throne room, he found a strange man sitting on the throne in full royal regalia. When the man was questioned, he simply replied that he had done so because the gods commanded him. We leave Alexander on this ominous note, but we will return to our story soon. So make sure to subscribe and press the bell button to see it. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive videos. Join the ranks of patrons and YouTube members via the link in the description or by pressing the button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, join our private Discord, and much more. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. This is
cool. We believe there are no insignificant.
Nice playing. So back to Babylon.
Reached Babylon in 323 BC. He apparently did so with many foreboding omens looming over him. The sources report that while he stayed in the city, the signs grew even more ominous, with birds dying around him and a mysterious figure seeming to take his place on the throne. Though Alexander would have no way of knowing it, his days were now numbered. His final weeks in Babylon are simultaneously some of the most widely reported, while also being some of the most contradictory and confusing. There are two main narratives, one that recounts Alexander's natural demise, and one that conveys a far more sinister sequence of events. In this episode, we will provide both versions of the last days of Alexander. As we approach the end of Alexander's life, we'd like to recommend a great way to review all the key points through the History of Alexander audiobook by our sponsor Manifest XM. Bingeable audio documentaries make learning new and interesting things easy, and that's 31st of May 323 BC. Having been hounded by ominous omens, Alexander arrived in Babylon, where he would finalize preparations for an invasion of Arabia, particularly the construction of a new harbor to hold the newly made coastal fleet that Nearchus would command. Alexander spent his days overseeing these preparations, touring the marshes and rivers around the city, and relaxing with his companions. However, as the sources near his final weeks, the narrative splits between the surviving sources that use the royal diaries and those that use the so-called pamphlet. The royal diaries give a day-by-day account of Alexander's movement, and were in turn reported by Arrian and Plutarch. On the 31st of May, Alexander celebrated a sacrifice to Dionysus, eating with friends and drinking late into the night. Alexander then left to turn in, but one of his companions, Medius, convinced him to come to a drinking party at his house. Alexander and the guests all drank heavily throughout the night. The next day, on the 1st of June, Alexander had a raging fever and slept in the bathhouse. The following day, he bathed and spent the day playing dice and drinking with Medius, and went to bed feverish throughout the night. On the 3rd of June, he was carried on a couch to perform his daily sacrifices, gave instructions to his officers about the upcoming Arabian expedition, and was moved to a cooler palace where he bathed and rested. The following day followed the same routine, Alexander giving some instructions, bathing and resting, but his fever became noticeably more severe by night. He continued this routine from the 5th to the 8th, his fever growing worse and worse. By this point, Alexander was terribly weak, unable to speak, barely able to move, and propped up by a pillow. Some of his companions were sent to the Temple of Serapis to ask the god what should be done, and they were told to leave Alexander as he was. Around this time, his soldiers began to become seriously worried about him, demanding that they be allowed to see him. Initially, Alexander's generals and bodyguards tried to prevent them from seeing him, but the soldiers grew increasingly angry, threatening to force their way into his chambers if necessary. The men and Alexander had feuded, but they had nonetheless spent 12 years fighting alongside each other. Alexander owed everything to them, as they owed everything to him. Some of these soldiers would have served under Philip, and would have known Alexander since he was a young man who commanded the flank at Chaeronea, and watched him develop from a boy to a man. For others, he would have been the only king they knew, nearer a god than a man, a figure who had led them against countless enemies and always proved victorious. Alexander's inner circle relented, and the men were allowed to see him. As they filed past him, Alexander, who had led the charges at Granicus, Issus and Gaugamela, who had crossed mountains and deserts with them, could do little more than weakly raise a hand in recognition. By the 11th, Alexander was dead, his last words supposedly leaving his empire, quote, "to the strongest." Arrian and Plutarch, who report this version of events, both refer to rumors that Alexander was poisoned, but are clear that they consider this to be only a rumor and that he died of natural causes. The account of Alexander's death in the pamphlet, reported in the so-called Alexander Romance, is markedly different, going into detail about the alleged poisoning mentioned by Arrian and Plutarch. According to this account, Antipater, Alexander's general governing Macedonia, had become fearful of Alexander, partly because of a rift that had developed between him and Alexander's mother, Olympias, and partially because he had been summoned to Babylon to meet Alexander. Fearing that he was to be punished or removed from power, Antipater had his son, Cassander, smuggle poison to Babylon. Once there, Cassander's brother Iollas, who was also Alexander's cupbearer, would use it to assassinate the king. As in the royal diaries, Alexander celebrates a sacrifice to Dionysus and leaves for bed, but is convinced to stay out drinking by Medius. The pamphlet claims that there were 20 other people at this drinking party. They were Perdiccas, Meleager, Python, Leonatus, Cassander, Pucestus, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, Eumenes, Nearchus, Philip the Doctor, Philip the Engineer, Stasanor, Olcius, Heraclides, Philotas, Meander, Asander, Ariston, and Iollas. Another source also adds that Proteus, a cousin of Cletus the Black, was present. The pamphlet then claims that only Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Olcius, Lysimachus, Eumenes, and Asander were innocent, and that all the rest knew what was going to happen next. Iollas gave Alexander a poisoned drink, the others talking amongst themselves while it took effect. Alexander then cried loudly and had severe abdominal pains, but soon managed to compose himself and urged the others to continue drinking. He, in the meantime, requested a feather to make himself vomit. Iollas provided one coated with more of the poison. This caused Alexander more pain, sending him into spasms, and he suffered throughout the night. He spent the next day in pain, and the day after, he began writing his will with the help of Ptolemy, Perdiccas, and Lysimachus. Ptolemy and Perdiccas, both wary of each other, pledged that if either of them were made the executor of the will, they would split Alexander's possessions between them. The following day, Alexander's soldiers threatened to kill Alexander's bodyguards if they were not allowed to see their king, and they were allowed to file past and see Alexander, who was by this point very weak.
That's, it's tragic. Tragic. And what could he have done, but what could he do at that point, Two or one.
Posed account of Alexander's will. In it, Alexander entrusts his body and the preparation of it to Egyptian priests, with Perdiccas being named the guardian of it. Alexander then requested that Thebes be rebuilt, including generous gifts to the city to help it prosper again, and names Craterus as the regent of Macedonia, Ptolemy the governor of Egypt, and Asia to Perdiccas and Antigonus. Philip Arrhidaeus, Alexander's brother, is then named king of Macedonia until Alexander's child with Roxana is born. If it is a boy, then he shall be king. If it's a girl, then the Macedonians can choose whether they want to keep Philip or appoint someone else as king. The will then almost completely contradicts this soon after. Ptolemy is named the satrap of Libya, Perdiccas of Egypt, and Pamphylia and Cilicia to Antigonus. A number of the other assigned satraps are also named: Thrace to Lysimachus, the Hellespont to Leonatus, Paphlagonia and Cappadocia to Eumenes, the islanders to Rhodes, Babylon to Seleucus, Phoenicia and Syria to Meleager. Perdiccas was then apparently given Alexander's signet ring, and Alexander is asked who he leaves his kingdom to, and he does not mention his brother or child, and instead replies, "to the strongest." These obvious contradictions in the will, as given by the pamphlet, clearly show that it was revised and edited at some point in history. While there are some similarities between the two sources, for instance that Alexander's health declined shortly after a drinking party hosted by Medius, and that he died days later, there are far more differences. The royal diaries makes no mention of the names of those who attended the drinking party, poison, abdominal pains, spasms, or a will, and gives no indication of Alexander naming any subsequent satraps. Similarly, the pamphlet does not reference a fever, Alexander's bathing, his conferences with his officers, or the Temple of Serapis. Therefore, we are left with two conflicting narratives, which give remarkably different accounts of Alexander's last days. Moreover, through source analysis, both of these chronologies have been determined to have originated shortly after the death of Alexander. In short, this means that two narratives emerged soon after Alexander's death: the version given by the royal diaries that he died of natural causes, and the version given by the pamphlet that he was poisoned. Furthermore, both versions have signs that indicate they were written with an agenda in mind. The royal diaries, for instance, are remarkably detailed and meticulous. It is therefore surprising that this is one of the only times they are referenced in our sources, and some modern historians have speculated that they were created specifically to provide a controlled, official narrative of Alexander's last days. On the other hand, the pamphlet is suspicious for how definitively it names those who were guilty and innocent of Alexander's death, and the various contradictions in Alexander's will. Both these points suggest that the pamphlet may have been written by someone who wanted to advance their political position by associating their rivals with Alexander's death and legitimizing their claims through Alexander's will. Whichever tradition is believed, there is one fact that all agree on: Alexander died on the 11th of June 323 BC. At the time, Alexander's wife Roxanne was pregnant, and he may have already had an illegitimate child, but there was no clear successor to Alexander's empire. Almost immediately after he had passed, his generals began arguing over who should manage the empire until his child was born, and who would govern the specific satraps. These disagreements grew quickly, and within a few short years, Alexander's empire was divided into various successor kingdoms, each ruled by one of Alexander's generals, and all claiming to be the legitimate heir to his legacy. In the ensuing wars, Alexander's entire family, his mother, half-sisters and brother, his wives, and his eventual son by Roxanne, were hunted down and wiped out. All that would remain of Alexander was his legacy and a multitude of unanswered questions. What future campaigns did he have planned? Would there ever have been a point where Alexander stopped his conquests? Did he aim to create a blend of Hellenic and Eastern cultures? Did he consider himself a god on earth? These questions and more have puzzled historians for millennia, and led to Alexander being one of the most studied and most famous figures in human history. Arrian was perhaps correct to say that Alexander would have approved of the timing of his death while he was still young and clothed in glory. Alexander frequently made conscious parallels between himself and his supposed ancestor Achilles, and he did this once again in his death. Homeric heroes were aware that they could not become truly immortal, but were instead driven by the need for glory so that their names might live on, and they become immortal in memory. So it was for Achilles, so it was for Alexander. For millennia after, Alexander became the de facto measure of quality amongst any who claimed to be a military leader, whether it be Hannibal, Caesar, or Napoleon. And so he did achieve his own ultimate ambition, eternal memory. Many criticisms can and should be leveled at Alexander, and modern views of Alexander are varied, some positive, others negative. However, whatever judgments are made of Alexander as a man, all can agree that the scale of his accomplishments was truly remarkable. He had defeated Illyrians, Greeks, Persians, Scythians, and Indians, conquered hundreds of tribes and cities, taken an army further than any European king before him, spread Hellenic culture across 3 continents, and ruled the largest empire humanity had yet seen, all before his 33rd birthday. At the time of his death, he was the most powerful man in the world, undefeated on the battlefield, and with a legacy that would prove to be immortal. In the final episode of this series, we will address perhaps the most asked question of Alexander: what killed him? So if you don't want to miss it, make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing. It helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get...
And that's it. We don't need to really concern ourselves now with, again, going over what killed him. He's gone. That they were that ruthless and cutting off bloodlines after, you know, getting to all of that. Whether any of that's true or not, that would be a darn shame, because if he was connected to the Anunnaki bloodlines, then again you're taking out the bloodlines of the people that are supposed to be in charge. Weird to say, we all think, you know, the free will thing, and it's a strange place when you're dealing with mythological biblical texts. Strange how they don't want us to, either that we don't have a map of that area over there, big rectangle. They don't want us to see what's there. Yep. What an interesting journey this has been. I really enjoyed it. I really liked Egypt. You know, there's something to see there, you know. They don't have this part of the world all updated. We don't have super high detailed maps of all these places. We don't have the Ancient Aliens Pack to go in and make sure that all these places are recreated, or, you know, at least, you know, the terrain is done right so we can see these structures that still remain better. All right. So I thought I would need at least 2 more shows, but it seems like that we have done it for the weekend, so, and it's 5 o'clock now. All right, so nothing to do it but to close it all down now, and we're not starting anymore, we're ending. So there we go. So this has been episode number 141, The Route of Alexander. And yeah, quite fun. I don't know where we're going next. I kind of want to fly back, to teleport back to Colorado. You should see it outside. We're in the middle of a snowstorm. We've just got over a foot of snow or more. It's glorious. I love it. I love the snow. So I don't know where we're going to pick it up from here. We need to get back to Germany and hook up with Hans and Henning again. We do some more glider training. We need to get back to DCS World to continue our fighter training. And I mentioned at some point during the show that let's find that out now. Manor Lords is coming out this year, and it's definitely not a flight simulator game. It's a like civilization building game. Manor Lords. Let's see when it's coming out. April 26th.
You have been chosen to govern a land of great peril and promise.
All right, so I need to hurry up. I haven't even finished Baldur's Gate. So I really need to finish up Baldur's Gate. And so around April 26th, we're going to be hopefully transitioning to Manor Lords in the evenings, at least. I'll work out a schedule so we can keep doing the Skydude stuff and Manor Lords. I don't want to burn myself out, but I have a tendency to do that. Okay.